up and it's time to do the changeover. So what I'd like to ask in this opening bit is, what are the values of science? By which I mean, what values should scientists have as scientists? And for the sake of argument and ease of argument, I'll phrase that in terms of a sort of a virtue ethics, meaning what virtues, and specifically attitudes, should scientists have? And the values of scientists, I'll take, are not constituted by what some scientists feel like subjectively. For example, if they subjectively feel like p-hacking because it gets them what they want, that doesn't identify the values of science. Instead, what are the values of science is a matter of rational justification. And what I'd like to do in order to sort of motivate that rational discussion is ask the question, what are the ethical attitudes that all researchers could rationally will be universally adopted to promote the flourishing of knowledge? That question, when we answer it, I hope will provide good values for science. And what I'll presume is that science is intrinsically a cooperative activity. And so it only works when we cooperate as scientists. So it's a social enterprise in that particular sense. Social enterprise involved in error correction. And so we need to identify the attitudes scientists will have that will promote cooperation and error correction. Some years ago, around about 2019, I was engaged in some Buddhist meditation on the four Buddhist virtues. And I realized in discussing with some mindfulness researchers in Leiden, at the Lorenz Institute, that the Buddhist virtues, suitably epistemically construed, defined the virtues that would allow knowledge to grow and flourish. So this view is put forward in this paper by Schumann et al. So what do I mean by that? Well, it is as if we're playing a jigsaw game, and we each have different pieces. So said Michael Polanyi, the Hungarian chemist, in 1962. And we must see how the other people put down the pieces to know how to play our pieces. We must each see what the other has in order to know what we should do. And this leads directly to the notion of open publishing, always pre-printing all papers, open data, open conferences like this one. Also, the collegiality that goes with this also implies the multi-lab studies that have become popular. The alternative point of view is to say it's not cooperation, it's competition that's necessary for science to flourish. And while competition, some element of competition cannot be avoided, competition promotes the opposite of openness, hiding knowledge, pursuing prestige, which are the very values which I think have produced the credibility crises which we now face. So it's not competition that should be promoted, but collegiality. The next attitude is concern for the problems of others. It's only because we openly provide solutions that others can use that science progresses. It's because we see someone else has a particular problem that we can help, that they progress, and when that's the norm, that they help us and we can progress and knowledge can progress. So when we provide open materials, open code, open hardware, we are offering solutions. It's a gift to other people. If we use proprietary hardware, we're not helping other people. If we use open hardware, we're helping the community. The third suitably reconstrued Buddhist virtue is delight in the achievement of other scientists. This is to shift the motivation from seeing the progress of knowledge not as a zero-sum game, whereas if they get ahead, we don't. We delight in the others because when they get ahead, we get ahead. The focus should be on the achievements they have in rigorously solving problems and having elegant solutions. And that is different than praising people for publishing in Nature or something like that, which I would never do. If someone said I publish in Nature, I'd say that's too bad, maybe next time it could be Diamond Open Access. And the fourth Buddhist virtue, equanimity, is impartiality, and of course is extremely important. So there's a set of relationships that constitute science when we perform science, namely the link from substantive theory to predictions, and predictions to data, and the evidential relationship of those data to the predictions that allow us to test the theories. Those relations are relatively objective in that we can be wrong about them. Indeed, that is why p-hacking is wrong, because it misrepresents the relation, the evidential relation between data and predictions. If you didn't think that, you wouldn't think p-hacking was wrong, but it is wrong. And it's wrong because there are objective relations which can be misrepresented, and what we want to do is to impartially assess those relationships. So this is achieved, for example, by registered reports, which I'll talk about later. It's also achieved by thinking about what we're doing when we're in discussion with other people as being curious about problems and their solutions. It's not about ego. It's about the impartial solution of problems. So when someone says, I have a theory such and I think the theory is wrong for a reason, I try and check myself from saying, your theory is wrong. Rather, I express it more impartially, or I try to, and sometimes fail, and say, the claim that is contradicted by this. Then that becomes a matter where we can each impartially engage together in finding the best solution and what are, in fact, the logical and inferential relationships between the claims that we're talking about. It also motivates, for example, some use of lottery and grant allocation, which is becoming more of a thing. It's the impartial. As long as you pass the minimum criterion, you impartially distribute money. So what are the ethical attitudes that all researchers could rationally will be universally adopted to promote the flourishing of knowledge? Well, what I offer, I'm not sure I precisely argued for it, but I hope it's sort of self-evident, that collegiality, concern for the problems of others, delight in the achievements of other scientists, and impartiality are those attitudes or virtues which will help knowledge grow, and they all lead to openness. And with those thoughts, I open the Centre for Open Science and Research Reform. You'll find out who's in the centre today because I invited them all to give talks to say how could they support people with open science practices and more rigorous research. So with that, I'll just take any questions before. Yes.
I really agree with you in terms of publishing and wanting to focus on high quality publications. Good science takes time, a long time. But I think we do live in a institutional and academic system where we hear this word publish or parrot, especially as early career researchers, which there is none here. It's quite tricky sometimes when you're that junior to hear like senior professors say, I spend lots and lots of time reading some paper sometimes to make sure it's rigorous enough for publication. When you're then looking for a job, you're then applying for grants or fellowships. Often you can't even start to apply unless you've got
Yes, I mean that's why nothing has changed. We're locked in by a series of incentives where each individual is personally incentivized to keep the system as it is because you're working within the system. So change has to happen from various directions, top down and bottom up. I think one thing to bear in mind is there are now two sets of values. There's you could call the old values, which are publish or perish, highest impact factor journal you can, get lots of grant money, that sort of thing. But there's also the values of open science, which have sort of become a thing. They're recognised. And maybe, especially in the UK, because of REF having open science as one of its criteria for assessment for the research environment, institutions do want early career researchers who have engaged with open science in order to help them get more engaged with open science themselves. So if you lost a few, you lost a publication or so because you did a registered report or you made everything open, you would be gaining on the other counter, even from the point of view of personal, what's best for you career-wise. But I agree, it's a tricky situation where the incentives are to not there are, well, at least there are a set of incentives not to do open science because it does slow things down. So what I would say is, open science is a whole set of practices, a smorgasbord. So you just pick from the ones that you can do and just sort of build up and seek in postdocs and future supervisors those who engage in open science. Yeah.
Well, we can kind of answer that and need your input. But there's, one of the things that I've always tended to say, and I said, right, I'm wedded to this, obviously, it's been a long-term mentor for me, so I've got onto this early, but being involved with two registered reports, I've always tended to say, yes, it's a lot slower, but we're doing the good science, and that's great. But I understand, so are the researchers. But, having said that, I believe Zoltan recently mentioned some really recent research with regards to registered reports, showing that actually, given that you've done all that work up front, we've gone through that stage one report where people will review it and give you feedback before you actually get it accepted, the actual time from start to publication isn't slow. Blew my mind, but it makes sense because what actually happens is that normally you write it up, different reviewers identify problems that you would have resolved, maybe gone through a stage one, you then maybe have to do a bit more work on it, or maybe you just end up having to submit it to multiple journals before it gets accepted. So if you look from start to acceptance, is that right?
Yeah, no, Chris Chambers had a PhD student at Cardiff, which Ben, but I'm blanking his surname, who did precisely this. He objectively looked at cortex, the time taken to publish a regular article versus a registered report. Now, with a registered report, there's two things from an early career researcher that's important. One is when it goes out to review at the stage one, this is my next talk after this one, the atmosphere with reviewers and editors is one of collaboration to produce the best piece of research that we can, because nothing is set in stone yet, nothing has been decided. That completely changes the atmosphere of the discussion between reviewers and editors. So that's nice from an early career, that your first introduction to getting reviews are ones which are collaborative. Second, because the paper is accepted at the stage one before you've collected the data, you're not going to go through the rounds resubmitting it to endless different journals. And it's that second factor which means registered reports actually, on average, have a 50% reduced time in getting a paper out than a regular article. So yeah, that was a good correction to what I was saying. If you can get a registered report in your PhD, it actually saves time. Although open science practices in general do take time. Yes. No. No. We're just a bunch of people who drink coffee and do stuff. It would be nice, wouldn't it? Yeah. Okay, pre-registration and registered reports. I may be telling you what you already know, but I just thought it'd be good just to fill in what is involved, and hopefully I'll say some things that you don't know. So pre-registration means you go on to something like OSF, you write up whatever you want to write up about what you're going to do. There's no policing of that. It's then set in stone on OSF, time-stamped. You then run your study, and you can follow your pre-registered analyses or not to whatever extent, and you submit it to a journal. And the journal can take into account your pre-registration or not, as much as they, or little as they wish. So pre-registration is an incredibly informal thing. It's saying in advance what your study is about and what you're testing and how you're going to test it. But there's no sort of oversight of how you do that, whether you've done it well or in a useful way. And there's no oversight of the extent to which you've engaged with that pre-registration when you finally submit the paper, unless a reviewer decides to. But a reviewer is also free to say, well, whatever analyses you think you pre-registered, I think they're not the best, and you should do my analyses. Because maybe they didn't like the results that you got. Or they might have good reasons for it as well. So pre-registration, by contrast, so that's pre-registration. It's informal, it's useful, and we always pre-register. But you might not be able to pre-register very well until you've been through the process of a registered report. And that's because with a registered report, it's a formal process, and you'll go through what you need to do to make this really work with some reviewers and an editor. So the registered report, which was introduced, well, the first editorial board was 2013 in Cortex, when the term registered report was first used. It does go back to the 1970s with parapsychology research. The idea's been around a long time, but in its modern incarnation, it was Chris Chambers who spearheaded it and worked absolutely tirelessly, like a juggernaut, creating registered reports, making sure that it's quality controlled and the quality is kept up as much as you can, and now used in over 300 journals, including the most prestigious, and in all areas of science. So that's been one of the success stories of the open science movement. So what happens is it has to be an article type that's recognised by the journal, and typically needs its own editorial board, so that they have expertise in registered reports. Stage 1 is submitted, which is your introduction, your methods, and your planned analytic protocol. And the purpose of that is to tie down all analytic and inferential flexibility. So the analysis should be absolutely tied down, so that you cannot, in the light of the results that could follow, try this, try that, I prefer these results, I'll go with this analysis. It's an attempt to tie down all analytic flexibility. But to do it in a way that addresses a relevant scientific question with the most apt procedures for doing that and the most apt analysis. So the stage 1 gets in principle acceptance when, as I was saying before, you've collaboratively worked together with experts from other universities, other parts of the world, other areas. So you've benefited from expertise to plan this study. You get in principle acceptance when everyone is signed off on that, with at least, well, specifically the editor. Hopefully everyone is signed off on it. And then you can collect your data. In principle acceptance, because as long as you do what you said you're going to do, and you analyse it the way you said you're going to analyse it, you will be accepted by the journal regardless of the results, no matter how sexy or unsexy that they are. No, so the journal can't make decisions based on its impact factors, whether they're going to accept this. So that the stage 2 is then when you've you've collected your data, you write it up, and then the reviewers at that point are mainly checking whether you did what you said you're going to do and whether the discussion was reasonable given the results. You can you don't have to do just your pre-registered analyses, but your pre-registered analyses form the main results section. You can then have another results section which is non-pre-registered analyses, and that's absolutely fine. In fact, if a reviewer says, I've thought about it some more and you should do this analysis, well, you can do if the editor thinks that would be useful, but that goes in the non-pre-registered analysis section. And the conclusions in the abstract and the bulk of the discussion should reflect the pre-registered results, mainly. I mean, sometimes you find pre-registered analysis were completely inappropriate for some reason, but that's not typically the situation. Typically the situation is the reviewer doesn't like the results because it goes against their theory. So one of the myths is, I don't want to be tied down to just the pre-registered results. Well, you're not. You can do you can also have a non-pre-registered results section, but it must be highlighted as that. This is the pre-registered results and this is the non-pre-registered results. I give a tutorial. There's a YouTube tutorial which was a conference workshop at the top for pre-registration, and that's a paper there at the bottom for guidance on writing registered reports. So why do I think registered reports do a good job, or what they're doing? Basically, they control bias. And to go back to the virtue of impartiality that I talked about, science at a certain grain of resolution can be construed as involving a theory, making predictions, which are tested by data. Now, what has happened in the past is this structure, this inferential structure, is reconstructed in the light of the data. And this leads to misrepresentation of the objective relations that exist. The most talked about is p-hacking, which misrepresents the relationship of the data to the predictions. So when you reconstruct this in the light of the data, you say, you walk down the garden of forking paths, as Gell-Mann says, and you find out if I exclude outliers by this method, if I transform by this method, if I add this covariate, and so on, I'm pushing the p-value or the Bayes factor in the direction that I want, and so you go down the direction pushing your p-value to where you want. That misrepresents what the data is actually telling you. But you've also probably had the experience of reading a paper and you come down to the predictions at the end of the introduction, and you know the only reason they made those predictions was because that's what the results were. Right? That shows that the predictions did not follow in a simple and scientifically justified way from the theory involved. They were arbitrary. So the relationship between theory and the predictions, as it actually exists in terms of what would be a simple inferential path, has been misrepresented by the paper because it's been reconstructed in the light of the data. So incidentally, talking about impartiality, what I now do, it's partly a way around this, or to make explicit this structure, is I never say I or we predicted that A will be greater than B. A will correlate with B, or whatever it is. Because that misconstrues the scientific process as one of what is at test, what is being tested is your ability to divine nature. But that is not what science is about. Science is not about is whether you are the Delphi oracle with your genius can make accurate predictions. But when you say, I predict that, and you go, oh, look, it came true, you think, aren't I great? But that isn't science. So what I say is, on this theory, this follows. On this theory, this follows. On another theory, something else might follow. It doesn't matter if I endorse any of those theories or which ones I'm going for, although I could state that in a positionality statement. I can state statements, I can put forward theories which I think are probably false, but it doesn't matter. As long as this theory makes that prediction, if the prediction fails, the theory is false. That's what's important. So now, pre-registration should say enough to tie down inferential flexibility, but no more than that. So in terms of the structure I've just talked about, it should be as concise as possible, laying out in skeletal form, so any fool could look at it in 2 minutes and see the scientific process naked in front of them. So if there's any holes in it, it's absolutely apparent. You say, this theory, this prediction tested by this statistical test or this statistical model, these outcomes lead to this conclusion. Very short. Now, a registered report is different because the stage 1 registered report is a full manuscript. But a pre-registration should not be a full manuscript, it should just be like this. So a person can check if you did what you're going to do. So how do you do that in a registered report? Well, in Peer Community In, we introduced the study design template, where you fill in a table which lays out those things I've just been talking about. Why do we have this prediction? Well, it's a manipulation check, and we want to know if the manipulation is effective in changing mood. That's the role that theoretical claim plays within the coherent whole of this particular experiment, and that's why it's necessary. Now, I might think this manipulation for changing mood is a crap one, I might think it's a good one. It doesn't matter. If it succeeds in changing mood, then it's done its job and the theory is passed, and if it fails, it fails. What I think doesn't matter. So in a registered report, we also have this concise table, which I always look at as a registered reports editor when I come to a stage 2. Well, when I come to a stage 1, to make it in place, to make sure authors have really thought about what is the most general claim that is being tested here, what are the actual claims at stake when I do these tests, and why does it matter? And then in stage 2, to check that they actually did what they said they're going to do, which I can check in a very quick manner. So I concisely indicate on this theory, this prediction. This prediction is tested by this pattern of results, the theory will be supported or refuted. So that's my advice for pre-registration and in effect for a registered report in your study design template. Okay, and that's my comments on registered reports. Any? Yes.
Thanks, Zoltan. That was really edifying in how it was structured and how we talk about these things. I was just wondering a bit about this formulation of on this theory, this prediction. I tend to be a defender of I predict. Not because I don't agree that if...
Because I'd ask, what is at stake when that prediction is passed or fail? Does it play a role in the overall structure of the experiment?
Yeah, I don't see it as a kind of an ego-affirming process. I see it more as if it's formulated as on this theory, this prediction is kind of enveloped in a mantle of objectivity, whereas when I read the registration, I want to also be able to assess whether I think that the way that the authors formulated the prediction follows from their theory. I think that's also something to be judged. So
yes.
When they formulate it as subjective, I think that's a bit easier to do that versus when somebody goes and says, this theory dictates this prediction.
All right. Get them to say on what theory this follows. Because often they mention some theories, I don't know, terror management theory or something, or whatever it is, evolutionary theory even, and then they just have some predictions. But it wasn't those theories that were tested. That's not what's at stake. It's something they haven't. Many authors are not very clear about what's actually at stake. I find as an editor, I have to help them say what's actually at stake. What are you actually going to conclude if this prediction fails? And the way to get them to be clear about that is to force them to say, what is the claim that's actually at stake here? You're not going to give up evolutionary theory if this prediction fails. You're not even going to give up terror management theory. So what are you going to give up? What is the most general claim that's at stake here that you would find this evidence, not necessarily give up, but count against if it were to go wrong? And the only way to do that is to get them to state it, and you find most people find this a far more difficult task than you would think.
I think I agree with the coupling of the theory with the prediction. I think I wouldn't remove the I, because I think the subjective nature of how people interpret the theory is more of a form argument that I'm making, but I think placing the researcher central to these research decisions is useful. I don't know. But
yeah, I mean, did you want to comment on that?
I wanted to have
another question, okay. So you're sort of, there's a sort of a qualitative influence maybe to what you're saying, which is sort of a somewhat different kettle of fish. But I think a positionality statement is somewhat different, because I agree it can be useful. I read a paper recently which was an adversarial collaboration, and they stated these authors have published 20 papers arguing for this position, and these authors have published 20 papers arguing for the opposite position. And I thought actually that was really useful. So knowing people's personal preferences, I agree it can be a useful thing, but I think that's a separate matter from trying to lay down what general claim is at stake if this prediction passes or fail, and we should be clear about what that is.
I feel like you're making the point that I often make of like no passive voice. I want to know.
these claims aren't made from the ether. There's no magical this follows from this. There's always some level of interpretation.
Thank you, Zoltan. Really interesting talk. And maybe misinterpreted what you said, or maybe I'm reading into it too much. But or maybe I missed something, a caveat that you mentioned. But it sounded like you were being a little bit prescriptive about how pre-registration should be skeletal, in your words, versus a registered report. I consider like my pre-registration is almost like half a manuscript, even if I'm...
Like a stage one registered report.
Do you think that that's a negative? Do you think that's a
Well, I think if you're going to do that, what you do need... I mean, remember the function of the pre-registration is for someone to check whether you did what you're going to do. If they have to get through 20 pages of text, it's almost impossible to check if you did do what you're... Even a careful reading, it takes a lot of work. So if you're going to do that, you do need at least somewhere something like the study design template, peer community, and you need you do need the skeletal representation there. I think that's the important thing about the pre-registration. How are we doing? You're the timekeeper.
Against reviewers that perhaps miss things or are less committed to finding deviations from the stage one. Because it only works when that peer review process is really effective. And it's so much work to check.
Yeah, that's why we had the study design template. The study design template told authors who didn't really know how to do stage ones what we're really asking for. And two, it helps to check at the stage 2 level. But I agree, reviewers don't, well, most reviewers don't sort of completely understand registered reports, so you definitely need an editor that keeps on top of that and double checks everything themselves until the community is more sort of trained in it.
Is it possible to do a registered report at the stage of the data collection before the process?
Yes, so the model I presented here is the classic one we first set up, but then it became apparent that there are cases where you could get the epistemic benefits of a registered report, but the data already exists. So in peer community, and we set up degrees of 6 different degrees of bias control. The strongest degree of bias control is the one I talked about, where the data doesn't even exist. The next one down is the data exists, but there is no way the author could have accessed it yet. There's some database that hasn't been released. Or the next level down would be, conceivably they could have accessed it, but they tell you that they haven't. And so on. So yes, we do allow that. And then when it goes through our system, each journal can say what level of bias control they're happy to accept. But we flag that level of bias control in the registered report so that people know what it was. Yeah, no. In fact, I think most journals, I haven't checked to be honest, but I think most journals do accept a degree of bias control less than the full one, the classic one I sort of been presuming in the talk.
Do you have any sense, because there was like 350 journals that accept this registered report publication format, do you have any sense of what disciplines are represented in the journals?
It's strongly psychology, but all disciplines are represented. Royal Society Open Science, for example, does all disciplines. Nature does registered reports. That's most disciplines. Peer Community In, we do all disciplines. We've just been dealing with one in nanotechnology and chemistry. Our very first registered report at Peer Community In was actually a qualitative paper. Any discipline.
So I'm from the library and I've done a couple of workshops, like introductory workshops on pre-registration reports, and what I've heard from people is that they'd like to have known about that earlier. So
Right.
Both researchers maybe they're further kind of down their research kind of journey. How do we get people outside of psychology, where it seems to be fairly established, how do we get postgraduate researchers to get it more embedded in other disciplines?
Well, having open days like this one, just getting the word out. I better wrap up here. It's a good point. I don't know how to fully address it. Should we move on to Jennifer? If you could do that because of my Parkinson's, if you click on the PowerPoint, you'll see your talk. Just hover over that.
Yeah.
And then
Okay. Thank you very much. Oh, nice. Okay. Here we go. Give everybody just a second to Do you want me to start at 26? Yeah. On the 15th. Okay, everyone. Thank you for your attention. If you'd like to join me again, appreciate it. Hi. Oh, I'll stop using my Jubilee lecture theater voice. I don't think you really need lead it in this space. My name is Jennifer. I am a senior lecturer in psychology, and I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about critical AI literacy in open science. So let's have a look at that. So I'm just going to focus in straight away on particular aspects of AI to get a bunch of stuff out of the way that I don't want to talk about today and don't care about. The very clever and popular marketing term AI is used to encompass a whole bunch of different or unrelated or minimally related technologies, which are unfortunately becoming more related as AI is crammed into every corner of every technological apparatus that we currently have access to. But the thing that I'm particularly interested in talking to you today is generative AI and large language models. So that's what we're going to focus on. Although things like text autocomplete and caption generation and everything else is also integrated with large language models as well. So these kinds of models, I'm using some definitions from a paper from last year, basically sophisticated statistical models that depend on vast swathes of data that have largely been stolen and that that use huge amounts of energy and resources in order to operate. They can represent various statistical distributions and exist in a displacement relationship with humans, which means they take over the things that should be the remit of humans, and particularly scientific and creative endeavors. So generally, we're talking about large language models like ChatGPT, Claude, Grok, Copilot, which every time I open Outlook is like, get 3 things to do. I'm like, I don't want 3 more things to do. Leave me alone. Okay, so how to use generative AI in open science. Now, if you know me and you've spoken to me on this topic at all for the last several years, you know exactly what I'm going to say next. I feel like I should have a disclaimer at this point that I am not the only person in this center, and I am not the only person who has opinions on this, and I'm sure some of my colleagues will have quite different opinions from me, so if you don't like my opinions, you're welcome to ask them about what they think instead, but generally my opinion is this: don't. And more specifically, contemporary AI is research misconduct. It is perpetuating all of the things that open science is designed to prevent, and it does it in such a way that it is invisible and hard to detect. So what I would suggest is not using it at all. Just as a easy definition of kind of what open science is, this is the UNESCO recommendation on open science, and I bolded a little bit of that definition. Particularly, we're looking into the scientific enterprise that focuses on reproducibility and transparency, and increased opening of scientific content, tools, and processes. So the point of open science is to make it clear where ideas have come from, how they were tested, where that data came from, why we believe or think or reject particular ideas. This is why I'm going to argue that generative AI is antithetical to open science, that it does all of those things in reverse and makes everything harder to trace back, to understand, and to find out where it has come from. So if we look, for example, at just the models themselves and the way that they are constructed and marketed, especially the really big out-of-the-box proprietary models all have closed source code, which means we don't know how they are constructed, how they work, or why they work the way that they do. And then, of course, there's the ongoing issue of scraping the entire internet, including all of our own proprietary work, for model training, which would then get sold back to us to do a worse version of what we did already. So a few links here for ongoing, the first one is an ongoing tracker for many, many cases of IP and copyright violations against various AI companies. And the one after is particularly about publishers of scientific journals selling those things that we paid them to publish to AI companies so that they can produce a machine that writes those papers for us so we don't get to do it anymore. Sorry. Okay, so that's just the general problem with the infrastructure overall. But I also want to talk about a few different particular problems that are a threat to open science practices. Now, I understand, I can tell from the vibe in the room, that some people are going to agree with me on this and some people won't. And my goal here is not just to yell at you, although I'm enjoying it and I'm doing a great job. My goal isn't just to yell at you. My goal is that when you are thinking about open science practices, that you are including in your evaluation of transparency and reproducibility these elements that can make things easier or quicker and more efficient, but also can have hidden or unexpected implications that you might not be aware of and that you might not recognize if you aren't aware of sort of the underlying infrastructure that informs and produces AI models. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the ways that these different aspects of AI models and the use of them can be a threat to open science, even if you are doing everything, I'm going to use big air quotes here, right otherwise, that these models can potentially introduce issues that you might not be expecting. So I'm going to talk about a few of those. So bias and hallucinations, something that I think we're generally familiar with, but I'm going to talk about that particularly in the context of open science. Code vulnerabilities and data protection, statistical depth, and then how that threatens accountability, reproducibility, replicability, and kind of scientific integrity generally. So I think we're all aware that LLMs regularly produce hallucinations with more or less frequency depending on what you ask them. This is an inherent property of the way that large language models work. We'll never get rid of it. It's what they do because they are designed to be confident and to give answers, and when they don't know the answer, they just produce the most statistically probable series of tokens, and whether or not that's right is not the issue. It's just whatever it is. They are also extremely susceptible to bias in the training data, and so they exacerbate the existing bias in whatever training data they have been trained on. Unfortunately, what we're trying to do as part of our open science practices is reduce bias and not perpetuate the same patterns of results or to challenge those things instead. So that can be a threat to the way that to the progress we're trying to make in bias reduction and understanding what is actually the truth or the true relationships that we are interested in. Large language models instead tend to amplify and exacerbate the bias that already exists in those in the training data, which, as I said before, we don't have access to. So that can introduce errors in code, inaccuracies in transcriptions. I don't think I have the, oh yes. For example, in medical transcriptions, things like hallucinating particular medical issues that the GPs have not actually said based on, for example, the ethnic origin of the patient because of bias in the training data, that sort of thing. And because depending on the source of the what you are using them with, those errors might not be recoverable. So you introducing problems that you then don't know where the problems have entered. So one of the things that I care a lot about is coding and data protection. And this is something that I'm not going to call you out too specifically, but I'm sure Reny is going to talk about in her talk a bit. But meaningful and expert data analysis critically relies on context. You have to understand what you are doing in order to know how to approach a data set or an analysis sensibly. You need to understand how and why the data was collected, the theoretical structure that's currently under examination, and how and why a particular measurement or design was chosen and what the relationships expected between those variables might be, and a whole bunch of assumptions and information that isn't in the data set itself. It's part of the way that that data set was collected and why it was constructed or gathered in a particular way. I assume Reny's going to talk about this. I think Martina's probably going to talk a bit about that as well. So that connection between context and analysis can be endangered or not carried through using large language models, for instance, to produce code if for analysis purposes when it is not properly supervised. Oh, I really do have to speed up. I'm not going to talk too much about slop squatting, mostly because I don't want to say too much about it, because it's gross. But the main thing is that there's a necessity for human oversight in, if you are going to, I do feel like I'm giving some sort of like abstinence-only talk. If you are going to use an LLM, you have to be really careful. Okay, all right. Something that I suspect might come up in Andy's talk as well, the statistical expertise and the necessity for balancing the potential for using large language models in statistical analysis, which can offer maybe statistical techniques or methods that you might not be able to program yourself or be familiar with yourself, but that has to be balanced with whether you have the expertise or someone on your team has the expertise to implement them properly and understand what the implications of that analysis are. So there's really a trade-off here, and these papers are talking about a solid conceptual foundation is essential, so essentially an expert. So, and since I'm getting more preachy by the second, I'm not going to talk too much about cognitive offloading and the wonderful new term that has been introduced in a paper earlier this year, cognitive surrender, which is basically the idea that you hand over decision-making to some exterior actor, like a large language model that writes the discussion for you, and you just go, that's probably fine, whatever it said is what I'm going to go with, without interrogating it in depth. LLMs pose risks to data protection in terms of slop squatting. So this is injecting like malicious code, essentially, that is likely that might be hallucinated by large language models. Data integrity in the course of data analysis, research integrity from hallucinated references, bias mitigations because we have unknown sources of training data, statistical integrity, and academic rigor. So basically, at every stage of the process, there are risks to using large language models that can threaten the integrity of open science techniques, because we don't, essentially you're introducing an unknown actor who is unaccountable for what they contribute to the research process. So, if you get nothing else out of this except that I just yelled at you for 15 minutes, the key thing that I would like to say is that whether and how to use AI in the research process is not a neutral proposition. It's not just something that makes things easier or faster. It is a decision that you are making about whether to engage with a system that is potentially based in unethical practices and might introduce unethical practices to your workflow. So obviously your research is your responsibility, but it's also your responsibility. So when you introduce AI work into your open science practices, you need to know what the implications are of introducing those things at each stage. So it would be great if you can find a nice center full of friendly people who are experts in their field who would be happy to advise you on how best to tackle these particular things. Especially, I didn't memorize, unfortunately, Zoltan's list of open science principles, but I really strongly believe that it is all of our responsibility to do good science and to help each other at every stage. And all of the things that AI can help us do quicker or better, I think we will get more benefit out of doing together instead. So, that's it.
A lot of the criticisms one can make of the bad effects of AI can be made also just from asking someone else. I mean, people hallucinate, have biases, don't necessarily grasp the context you're talking about, and so on. So, I mean, if you extended the conclusion too far, it would say, you come to the, extended the logic too far, you come to the opposite conclusion that you came from. Which is don't trust other people because they're biased.
Yeah, but I disagree because you can challenge people. You can go back to them and hold them accountable. You can say to them that they were wrong and that, or they misled you, or they gave you false information. You can have an interaction with a human person that, you know, on some meaningful level. There is no way to have a meaningful, like to challenge an LLM to say, oh, you were wrong about this, and it will go, and it will tell you the wrong thing again. Like, there's a difference between building collaboration and trust between experts that you know have built a relationship with you and you have faith in their expertise, and a word generation machine that tells you whatever you want to hear at any given moment. And that, for me, is the difference, is the accountability that you can hold people to. And the unaccountability of large language models means that you are introducing something into your process that you cannot, you cannot hold it to any sort of standard. It's a coin flip tool that may or may not land the right way up, but if it doesn't, that's on you. Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think this is super interesting as a topic, and I think it really follows on nicely from what you were saying, Zoltan, considering the overall kind of ethical picture in academia. What you're talking about in goods and virtues, very human and spiritual, almost in nature.
Yeah.
But crucially, that kind of impartiality is something that AI just absolutely does not have. It has zero discernment at all. And I think that's such a part of the problem, because thoughts so true what you said initially about marketing around AI. It's deferential to us, but we become deferential to it because it kind of has such good marketing that it kind of emits this kind of certainty that I think it's still unsurprising seeing the rate of kind of undergraduate students just using AI in their kind of every single submission, because it's become such a kind of well, why wouldn't I? We believe in science, this is the science, I'm using the science to achieve a certain outcome here. And it is really again, this kind of against things like scientific exploration and kind of basic things, it really doesn't allow for that. The whole system is kind of built around a bit of an input, and AI just maps perfectly onto that.
Yeah, it's sort of purpose-built for the kinds of practices that I think open science is trying to push against, which is just create something as quickly as possible. It's a creating something as quickly as possible machine, which is great if you don't care about what it is that you're creating and you just need something, which is kind of the publisher perish process. But I think you're all here because you care about the things that you create and you want to do good science. And that, as we were just talking about, that isn't a fast process that can be easily automated.
Great. Time. Okay.
I was just going to help you with your slides. Is this you?
That is me. Thank you. All right. Wasn't there a good time, maybe 4 years ago, when we didn't have to worry about AI and our biggest problems were, measurement, things like this? Of course, it's also a bit awkward that I'm following Jennifer. My slides are completely AI generated. So and that is a joke. And that is a joke. Okay, so I don't do meta-scientific research on scale development and on scales. And this was supposed to be a presentation that was done in conjunction with Jenny Terry, who couldn't be here today. She's left this slide for us, essentially. So my work is, I essentially use scale development in my research rather than researching scale development itself. So a lot of my presentation is going to be about how I've tried to kind of dip into the meta-scientific literature and in a self-serving way, essentially, to improve my own practice. But Jenny does do meta-scientific work in this sense, so she does some work on construct validity, jingle-jangle fallacies, measurement of various meta-science, and she has expressed that she's obviously very happy to take questions on any of these issues. Okay, so the issue of measurement in psychology, as in any science, is as all this time, right? We make some claims, and we usually make claims that look like this. Construct A relates to construct B. Pulling on an example from my own literature, let's say sense of belongingness, which is a construct, relates to people's sense of self-esteem, positively predicts sense of self-esteem. Of course, that's not what we actually do, right? That's not what we actually test. What we test is whether measure A relates to measure B. So what we do in practice, we might have a scale like the general belongingness scale and see if it is predictive of the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. And in order for these claims to be true, we need to have a correspondence between our constructs and measures. If that doesn't happen, then our claims aren't accurate. And more this has been kind of discussed in the open science and reproducibility literature. Jessica Flake will feature heavily in this presentation, talks about this. This is a quote from her. If psychological scientists improve on all forms of validity in their research, including construct validity, original studies will be better tools for detecting true, meaningful, and replicable effects. So she's already kind of hinting at how measurement might be a core issue for reproducibility. In terms of how it's been formally discussed, many of you might be familiar with the term questionable research practices. So these are the decisions in the research process that might produce misleading conclusions. So things like p-hacking. But Flake and Fried also termed the notion of questionable measurement practices, which is very similar. It's to do with the decisions that researchers make that raise doubts about the validity of the measures used in a study, and ultimately the validity of the conclusion. So, how big is the problem? It's really hard to tell, because unfortunately, very few studies report the information that we would need to make that judgment about the validity of a scale as part of a paper. And when they looked at a selection of 433 scales randomly selected from Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2014, they found that 40% of these scales were reported without any information about their source. So not only was there no information about the validation of the scale, because you might be using existing scales that have been validated elsewhere, there was no information about where these scales came from. Supposedly they were made by the researcher, and that there wasn't any validation happening. But we don't know. We don't know what's with these scales. But the problem might be quite big, because, for instance, this is a study by Forster et al., 2008. I'm not picking on them. This is just a study that has been replicated in the Reproducibility Project Psychology, so that's part of the open science collaboration. And they did something that's relatively common practice. They had a measure that only had 2 items. They've created it specifically for the purpose of their study, which is looking at priming people with aggression and how that influences later social judgments. Yeah? And their primary dependent variable, target's perceived aggressiveness, was measured with these 2 items. In the original paper, so in their paper, these 2 items were strongly correlated, right? So they had a correlation of 0.63. They kind of averaged them together, formed an index of target's perceived aggressiveness, all good. Problem is, when this was replicated, they didn't find that strong replication. In fact, it was an R of 0.17, not usually the sort of R that would make you feel confident about averaging scores on those 2 items, but it did anyway, right? Because they were trying to replicate what happened in the previous paper. So essentially, when you have these kind of poor attempts at validating a measure, but then other people want to use your research, that tends to kind of compound the problem or perpetuate the initial issue. And perhaps people using that research will cite the original paper where the measure was developed ad hoc, right, as a sort of evidence for validation, even though that validation process was never followed. So, what I am suggesting is a structured approach to scale measurement, and this is not new. This is pretty much the structured approach that Flake et al. Recommend, and I've been trying to follow for the most part when I'm developing a new scale. I'll say a bit more about that in a second because it's relatively laborious. But it roughly follows a substantive phase, so this is the phase where you might be thinking a bit about what your construct is trying to measure, what things are about the construct, what things are outside that specific construct, and actually producing a pool of items, right? This may involve some sort of qualitative research. You might talk to people that have the same features as people who you might want to participate in your study to see how they think about the construct of interest. That is a relatively easy stage, I'd say, because it doesn't really involve any data collection. It's just kind of you putting the time to do that work. It could involve data collection if you do go the qualitative research route. The next phase is the structural phase. So this is where you actually get to collect some data and usually do something that involves factor analysis. There are other things you could be doing at this point, other statistical techniques. You can look at item response theory, for instance. I say that usually people do factor analysis here because it's it allows you to say something about the dimensionality of your scale, which you might not know how many dimensions your construct has. And on the other hand, it also kind of transitions quite nicely into something like structural equation modeling if you want to create scores, latent scores rather than observed scores. And finally, there's the external phase, which is this kind of process by which you're comparing your new scale to other existing variables, right? Seeing how it measures up. So this is where we're talking about convergent and discriminant validity and predictive and criterion validity and all the other forms of external validity. I'm going to focus a bit on the potential points of decision-making happening at the structural phase and the external phase. The substantive phase tends to be kind of personal to the researcher and their topic of research. So in the structural phase, there are quite a number of steps that ideally the researcher would follow. First, there will be the stage of item analysis where you just inspect your items, distributions, means, trying to see if your participants responded on the whole of your response scale, and then the bit where you're determining dimensionality, so the factor analytic phase, which normally it's kind of split into two phases. One is exploratory and the other is confirmatory. So usually what you would do is have one sample for the item analysis and the exploratory factor analysis, and then a second sample, run the confirmatory factor analysis, and then some reliability tests and perhaps measurement invariance. Now, reliability tests, I put the sign of alpha. I'm going to talk a bit about that on the next page as one of the points of contention where maybe some researcher decision making should be made. And measurement invariance is, for instance, if you want to apply your scale to two different groups, right? So let's say you want to do a cross-cultural study. You want to see that your scale behaves in a similar manner across these constructs. So, in terms of measuring reliability,
Most people use Cronbach's alpha. The problem with Cronbach's alpha is that it makes some very restrictive assumptions. It assumes tau equivalence, which means that it assumes that items within their factors have equal loadings, right? And that there is no cross-loading. It's quite a restrictive assumption. One alternative is McDonald's omega, which also makes an assumption. This is a more tenable assumption. It just assumes that there is a general factor. So assumes this kind of bifactor model. The other thing I wanted to quickly mention in terms of decision making, this time at the external validity phase, often what you do is you would like to check if your factors predict different things, right? Because that kind of makes the case that your scale would be multidimensional, if that is what you have found, right? So you might expect that factor 1 relates to outcome 1, and factor 2 relates to outcome 2, but factor 1 doesn't necessarily relate to outcome 2 that strongly, yeah? What you might do is run a linear model, plug in your 2 factors predicting each of the outcomes, and you might look at the standardized coefficients to see that one of the factors predicts the outcome more than the other, and you can see we found this here. Factor 1 predicts outcome 1 stronger than factor 2 predicts outcome 1. Excellent, right? There are some problems with this. Because your factors are likely quite highly correlated, you run into some issues with multicollinearity. So then you need to look at some more sophisticated solutions, for instance, such as dominance analysis, which allows you to establish the relative importance of one predictor over all other subsets of predictors in the model. So even if you have more than 2 factors. And then you test whether the pattern of dominance generalizes over bootstrap samples. So this allows you to say, you know, factor 1 is a more important predictor than factor 2 of outcome 1. And it kind of circumvents those multicollinearity issues. I'm illustrating these things to kind of show you that there are different kind of solutions that could improve your process as you're engaging in scale development. Okay. My main takeaway from today is that scale validation work is laborious, requires large sample sizes, and you need 2 samples as well. It's analytically complex. It is seemingly invisible because reporting is mostly relegated to supplemental materials. Even if you do see scale development work in published papers, tends to be like a little summary in the main paper and then in supplemental materials. But it's also worthwhile. Increases confidence in your findings, creates useful instruments that other people can confidently use, and it is foundational for reproducible science. And if none of those are convincing enough, the Bible says so. So, that's it. Happy to answer some questions. Yeah, Zoltan.
You've done the work in the order that you've described. You would end up with scales and subscales which have a single factor structure. So then, because if it didn't, you'd have something there. And then the convex alpha would be perfectly acceptable.
Oh, because you're thinking if you have a unidimensional scale, it would be perfectly acceptable to use.
Because if you didn't have a unidimensional scale, you would split it into subscales.
Well, you still have the... So there are a couple of things with convex alpha, right? So even if you have one single factor, it's still... Tau equivalent still refers to equal factor loading. So it's still, even with one factor, it still assumes that every item on that factor has the same factor loading. That's not true.
So what do psychologists do when they have a set of factor loadings and they go to scale? They weight all items equally in the scale.
Well, yeah, so I think that is a problem. Absolutely, and that is a problem. I mean, that's why...
The advantage of doing that is pure simplicity, because the factor loadings you get out of that. So the simplest solution is you weight everything.
Yes, but that is kind of an imperfect approximation. The other problem with Cronbach's alpha, which is a bit worrying, is the more items you have, the better it is. If you have more items on your scale, you'll have a higher Cronbach's alpha regardless of the inter-item correlations. You don't have the same problem with the omega. There are other problems with the omega because, of course, I mean, there are some cases where you, let's say you start off with an EFA, you have a nice factor structure, and then once you try to fit that bifactor model that is necessary for the omega, you might find that your factors ever so slightly differ, and that is inconvenient. It doesn't happen frequently, but it is very inconvenient when it does happen. So. Yeah, please.
Something I've always talked about using analysis when you're doing serial development. So you do literature review and you select items. So to what extent does the dimensionality of your scale just reflect the questions that you've selected?
Often it does, and I guess sometimes you can kind of go in purposefully coming up with items that capture a multidimensional structure. So I mean, it's not, factor analysis isn't magic. It kind of reflects back what you've put in to a certain extent. But sometimes, especially if the initial pool of items is the result of, say, some qualitative interviews where you might be talking to people and kind of try to transform their ideas around the concept into items, you might come in, like if you follow a very bottom-up approach, you might be genuinely, agnostic to how many factors you might obtain. So it could be surprising in that way. You don't want it to be too surprising because you obviously want to anchor it to existing literature and theory and things like that. But yeah, I think it's unlikely that you wouldn't have some vague expectation of what factors you will find.
Sorry, I'm going.
I'm recording.
Yes.
Are you going to transfer to my laptop?
I could do. Is this the open? What's it? OneDrive version that I sent you?
Yeah, there's OneDrive on.
Sorry, everyone. I just misbehaved and created 2 extra slides just to make Zoltan's life difficult. Pardon? Sorry?
A USB stick.
Well, or I can just omit my little sort of extra couple of slides. You know what? I can just show them for a moment. I'll do that. I'll just switch at the right moment, and then I won't upset your recording. Okay. So the reason why I did this is because I'm presenting for someone else. So I'm Miguel. I'm in the School of Life Sciences and presenting for Filip Janiak, who's also in Life Sciences and is the person who is now running the open hardware facility in neuroscience. Philip couldn't be here today, but we thought it would be important to be for this work to be represented here, and for someone to set up Philip's stall for him, as it were. So what I'm going to do today is set up Philip's stall and sort of sprinkle that with a couple of historical comments about how this all started. So, I should say these are mostly Philip's slides. Why open hardware? And I think I hardly need to introduce the general principles as to why we want to use open source equipment in the lab, as well as for the equipment that we use to generate our data to be open source, as well as to consider these principles in all the other steps in a research project. And one of these obvious arguments, which perhaps goes beyond what's on the slide, goes to what Jennifer was talking about earlier, which is that when you are using commercial equipment, you're essentially devolving control over how your data are generated to literally a black box, right? And so it is very similar to the problem that you raised with generative AI in particular. And that has both issues of principle, but it also has practical consequences, because the control over the device that you're using to generate your data is in the hands of a manufacturer. And from a practical point of view, that means that when it breaks down, you are held at ransom, literally, to get it working again. And that has hugely significant practical consequences for example, the cost of doing research, right? And we can sort of just about afford to do research at an institution like this, but if you are concerned about the access of researchers in low and medium income countries, for example, to the physical resources needed to do research, then that becomes a huge problem, right? So, if you are developing a new technique in neuroscience in particular, which is a highly tech-intensive and highly tool-intensive field, how do we ensure that that new technological advance is available to other people as well, not just to the rich labs that can develop it or use it or pioneer it in the first place? And to give you an idea of the size of the scale of this particular issue, just here at Sussex, we've calculated that the savings in having an open hardware lab that can repair things locally rather than just outsource the repairs to the manufacturers are on the order of 60K probably a year, something like that, which we would have to pay for either through grants or putting it on. I was going to say developers, but perhaps I shouldn't say it. Okay, and then finally, there's the whole issue of how we increase our capabilities, right? So when we are trying to drive forward in new research projects, it may depend on having new purpose-built parts and designs which are just not feasible, at least not within the lifespan of an individual project to generate from a commercial manufacturer. So open hardware is more than cheap kit. It's not just about finding a 3D printer where you can kind of print out a little plastic bit that will then kind of mount onto your device. It's a whole process, and the reason why this process, why it makes sense to have this whole process, is that it increases reproducibility, rigor, and the shareability of the ideas that we have to generate new equipment and solutions. And so there's a whole suite of steps that take open hardware resources, open labware resources from just a local fix to a capability that is then shared across the community. And that is one key aspect of the work that's been done at Sussex Neuroscience through the last few years. Now, the things that Philip can actually help with include all the steps in this pathway. So from 3D printing, prototyping, locating the right kind of smaller electronic devices that can then be put together and set up on experimental rigs, designing new rigs from the ground up, training users, troubleshooting equipment, producing documentation, ensuring that there is a, if you like, a paper trail, and that validity is assured from the moment that the equipment is designed to the time that it's used. Right, so that's Philip, and he is based here. So if those of you who were familiar with open hardware work at Sussex Neuroscience may have met with the people responsible at various locations in the university. The place where Philip can be found today is in the lower level of the CRPC building in a fairly large lab, which is the one captured in the pictures. This is right under the CRPC seminar room on level 3 for those of you who've been to Sussex, to neuroscience seminars. Okay. So I'm going to give you a flavour of a few of the projects that are going on at the moment, and also the history, how these capabilities began, just to give fair credit to the people involved. So So some of the work that Philip is doing at the moment includes things like microscopy equipment that's both designed in-house and controlled by custom-written software. The equipment itself can look like this. These are light collection systems for scanning microscopes, in particular for two-photon scanning microscopes, which would cost hundreds of thousands of pounds from a commercial manufacturer and can be just built here using 3D printers and lenses and so on and so forth. He's currently validating these and they will be published relatively soon. We acted as guinea pigs for some of this equipment, we meaning my lab. The reason for that was that we literally just could not afford the upkeep of our commercial microscopes and then switched over to this sort of equipment, and it worked. So, or it started to work after some attempts. I mean, I could get into the details of what each of these bits and pieces is, but I think it'll be better to have some time for one or two questions at the end, perhaps. So, I will. No, I am not going to risk it and try. No, I am going to risk it and try to move to the extra slides I made. Sorry, just a second. Come on. Okay. Okay. So the reason why I added these extra slides is because I wanted to give some historical credit for how this work developed. So this Open Labware work stream in Sussex Neuroscience started in Tom Badden's lab a few years ago, and was really powered by the work of Andrei Mariachagas, who many of you may remember as being the person who set up these capabilities around here. So Andrei started in Tom's lab and was involved in several projects like this sort of mini microscope that is usable for microscopy, optogenetics, behavior control in small creatures like zebrafish, Drosophila, C. elegans. That's been around for a while and has now been adapted for use in many different kinds of settings, including in sub-Saharan Africa, and is used for training there as well. Now, that then turned into a sort of setup within Sussex Neuroscience where Andrei was one of our two senior scientific officers and was sort of given the ability to lead all these projects from his workshop. And so that led to Andrei creating a large repository of open source tools, including things, so this is the GitHub page for the resources. The QR code takes you there in case you're curious. And this is just the start of a very long list of projects involving anything from repairs to new codes for running electronic setups, to devices for providing light stimulation, to microscope pieces, as you've seen, and so on and so forth. For example, these things have different degrees of sophistication. So the thing you see on the top right is just a centrifuge machine. And the thing that you see on the top left is an open source microscope that's been modified to actually constitute a sophisticated microscope stage for nonlinear imaging. So different levels of ambition. Okay, so that's my historical survey concluded, and I can go back to the actual slides. Sorry again, Zoltan. Right, and I've managed to actually mangle the order of these slides again. Right. So the other thing I wanted to include here was a sense of how this has felt for an individual project. And so for that, I'm using an example from my lab and how we interacted with this sort of work. So at one point, we realized that we wanted to go beyond the usual highly reductionist design of experiments in my particular sort of niche area of neuroscience, where typically mice are held in position and asked to distinguish between highly kind of reduced sets of stimuli. And so this is a little bit like the situation in sensory psychophysics work in humans as well, where you have highly controlled lab settings which are designed to extract the maximum, to extract data with the maximum possible statistical power, but at the cost of sort of real life, if you like, real behavioral realism. And in mouse experiments, usually what happens is we overtrain mice on some highly kind of fixed contingencies and try to get what capabilities the mouse has to make decisions in this highly real setting. And so we wanted to see whether we could examine mouse behavior when they are just moving around in an intrinsically motivated sort of sensory guided behavior where we provide clues for them to make decisions, but they are sort of working under their own sort of cognitive power or cognitive motivation to make decisions when we're not forcing them to make those decisions. And the design we came up with is a maze which is completely modular. You can kind of mix and match pieces. It's made from these little plastic pieces that you can see here. Sorry, I'm not seeing the cursor. No, it doesn't seem to be working. Anyway, so the image on the left shows you hopefully you can see this maze or labyrinth made from pieces of what looks like black plastic, completely opaque. It's actually opaque only under visual illumination. If you image it in the infrared, it looks like this. So it's, I don't know. Okay, I'm going to have to go back to the other presentation. This was not part of what I expected, sorry. So I was not expecting that I wouldn't be able to play the movie on the other computer. Okay, so as you can see, under infrared illumination, you can see what the mouse is doing. The mouse is super happy in there because it thinks it's in this nice, cozy, dark environment because under visual illumination, it's all dark. But we can provide all manner of devices to both stimulate the animal, deliver rewards, deliver different sounds, and just let it get on with whatever it thinks it's doing, exploring the maze and so on. And we can add as many corridors as we want. The image on the left is composed of the same number of pieces as the movie that you see in the center. So the same number of plastic pieces have gone on into the labyrinth on the left as on the center, but it's reconfigured for a completely different labyrinth. And the whole point of showing you this is that this maze was built entirely in-house for a couple of £100. It's super lightweight. It can run on any old kind of Sussex desktop PC without requiring new computer equipment, and so it can be rolled out anywhere. I mean, this, and so, for example, we are working with people, again, in Africa so that they can sort of roll out these behavioral rigs there. And can be used to integrate different sensory modalities, tasks that are models for example, reinforcement learning, model-free versus model-based, and to provide much more powerful behavioral phenotyping than can be achieved actually with commercial equipment. So for me, this is testament to the power of these approaches to not just save money, but to improve our capacities for doing interesting stuff in the lab. So, done. I will just skip to Philip's address in case you would like to contact him. Questions? Okay, yes.
I don't know very much about this. I don't tend to use large populations of data in my research, but I just wondered about IP.
About IP.
How that works with these types of things like the example you gave. How are there things that you have to do to make it open access? So say you've got funding, for example, to do this from a funder, and then there's sort of owns the IP. I don't know, how does that work?
So, I mean, so this speaks to something else which I'll come to about the funding. So, the way we've funded this work has been partly in-house. So Andre's position and now Philip's position are internally funded. And they are partly funded also by colleagues in Sussex Neuroscience who feel that the contribution of this work is going to be compelling enough in a grant that they can put them on a grant. And most of those have been UKRI grants, all welcome. And those funders are all interested in facilitating open research, and so they're usually A, happy to fund it, and B, will have expectations around the kind of community licenses that we put this under. The GitHub repository is all completely open source, and people can access this work, and most of these are under, I'm lacking on the name of the licenses, but the standard licenses that you would expect for open source data as well. Yes.
So this is fabulous. Really appreciate this all. Love the fact that this facility is there. Because I'm sure many of us are in a situation where there are projects that we don't even consider because of the cost of the extra equipment that we need. So am I right in thinking we could at any point sort of say, right, get in touch with Philip and say that we'd really like to purchase this equipment. This is what it does. Is this something you can do? What sort of cost are we looking at?
So in practice, I think that's how for example, that's what Zoltan did, right, at one point.
Yes.
That's how it's worked with Andre in the past.
Contacted Andre, said I needed it. He said, commercial prices were 15K. He said, I'll build it for 800. So I needed a source of money for some hundreds.
Yeah, as opposed to some thousands.
But as opposed to some thousands.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the extra value of the months in science around the world, but for us as individuals in the university that at the moment it's not rolling in money.
Yeah, it's great. It's fantastic. That was when I had another PhD student who wanted one. He just looked up the GitHub instructions and he built it. Yeah. For 200 pounds.
I mean, there may be some times where it's more difficult and more expensive, but that's really, really good.
Yeah, and that ethos of people then being able to sort of build on what's being done and bring the next person along is very much part of this, right? And I'm not sure if Hacksberg is going to talk about that later in the context of the library. Oh, sorry, yeah. In the context of what was built in the library by Andre, but it's certainly part of the overall idea. The one caveat I would give, though, is that, of course, it's an ongoing project to keep these positions alive at the university, as we go implied, right? And so, to the extent that if you have an idea, it's something that can generate external funding, and that we can then put some of their time on external funding applications, that would be great. Because it's really, you know, it underwrote about 40% of unrated summary at the time. That was really important to make sure that these things are sustainable and actually increase the chances of our research getting external funding. So it's a very circle thing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so right before lunch, I'm going to tell you about the reproducibility checking scheme that runs in the School of Psychology. It's been running for the last 2 years or so. And in these certification scheme, I focus specifically on computational reproducibility. There are many flavors of reproducibility, but this is like the baseline one that you want. That's the one you want to have at least. Which refers to the ability to rerun the same analysis on the same data set and obtain the same numerical results, figures, tables, and inferential conclusions. Now, even though this sounds like a very baseline quality that we want our research to have, it turns out that most published papers are not reproducible. So this is a study from 2016 where around 1,500 researchers across different fields were asked with their experience with reproducibility. About 70% of the researchers said that they've tried and failed to reproduce a study conducted by someone else, and about 50% said that they've tried and failed to reproduce one of their own studies. This is obviously bad. And something that people are always surprised about, this finding is something that people are always surprised about when I tell them that it's way, way worse than the indicatives. Most people think that studies are trustworthy and reproducible, so when you read a paper, you can trust the numbers that you read. And they always also think that it's quite an easy thing to achieve, but in reality it's not. So this is one of my favorite examples of how annoying it can be to try and make something reproducible. So in this paper, which is basically a rant, the authors tried to reproduce a computational model of the basal ganglia. The source code for the model was 6,000 lines long. That's a lot of code. No one has time to run that much code. And also it didn't run due to missing packages, all sorts of errors, and so on. So the authors decided to just write it from scratch. They couldn't run the original code. When they started doing that, they realized that the information in the manuscript was not enough to reproduce the model. There were factual errors, there was missing information or ambiguous information. So they enlisted the help of two of the original authors of the model. Now together, they managed to finally rewrite it in a way that it's completely reproducible. You can download it, you can run it, it works. But it took them 3 months to achieve this, which in their own words is hardly acceptable for something that should be relatively straightforward. So, in a nutshell, while computational reproducibility is a baseline quality that we want our science to have, most science doesn't have it. And when you try to make it so, it's quite difficult to do, even for something that appears to be or is considered to be easy or should be easy. Now, one solution to this would be to do in-house reproducibility checks before a paper is sent out to review. And we've been doing this for the last several years, where people can, in the School of Psychology, can send me their manuscripts when they're ready for publication. I try to run them and hopefully improve the reproducibility of the articles. The key aims, obviously, are to improve the trustworthiness of the research we publish. The process is very collaborative, so I help people gain the skills to then be able to do reproducible research in the future from the get-go. And it also fosters the culture towards better open science practices, better reproducibility practices, and so on. There are many reasons why you should do this to yourself. First, people are generally impressed when they read that an article has been certified as reproducible. Editors think it's great, reviewers think it's great. I don't know what readers think, I assume they think it's great. Going through this process, obviously, it helps spot any errors and mistakes in the manuscript or the materials, which then hopefully makes people more confident in their ability to share their materials online. And finally, journals are beginning to pay more and more attention to these problems. Now, it's worth saying that in some fields like economics, checking the reproducibility of papers before they're published has been the norm for a while, but it's catching on to other fields as well. So just as an example, psychological science is now strongly encouraging people to go through a reproducibility check before they submit their manuscript for publication. They offer also a reproducibility badge if your article is reproducible. And their goal in the future is to make computational reproducibility a blanket requirement for publication. Metapsychology is an example of a journal where they have strict reproducibility requirements. So for a paper to be published in metapsychology, it needs to be certified as reproducible, otherwise you can't get it in. And there are other examples. These are just to give you an idea of what's happening. Now, very briefly, the process for the reproducibility checks that I do. Participation is completely optional. People who opt in need to be able to make their analysis code-based, because in the beginning I was allowing people to send me things done in SPSS or so on, and it wasn't good. It was too difficult and took too much time. So now the requirement is that everything needs to be code-based, and some data must be shared. Ideally the raw data, but if you're in a situation where you can't share the raw data because of anonymity, confidentiality, or so whatever, a minimally processed data set, or if there are other solutions, works. You just need some data to be published online so that people can run the analysis. Now, after people opt in and make their materials openly available, I would write an initial report where I would highlight any results that didn't reproduce, as well as any areas in the manuscript or the materials where transparency and openness can be improved. People would then make any amends to their materials if they want. At that point, I would put together the final report, which I would upload on OSF. And at the end, people can then mention the fact that their manuscript has been certified as reproducible in the paper. So here we've got Julian as a sentence in the abstract highlighting the wonderful work that has been done to make sure that the work is trustworthy. Very, very briefly, people are always surprised how long the reproducibility report template is, because most people just assume it's going to be the numbers that I check, but I check way too many things other than that. So we've got the first section looks at what data is shared, whether it's the raw data, whether the data is described in a way that people can use it, because without the README file and without the data dictionary, even if you make your data available, if people don't understand what your variables are, they won't be able to assess your results, so they won't have any idea what's going on. I also look at what software was used for the analysis. Ideally, you want the software you're using to be open source, so that everyone can have access to it. As I mentioned, at this point, I do require people to do their analysis in a code-based software, so then the questions in that section relate to how easily the code runs, whether there are any issues, how legible the code is, whether it's organized in the same order as the manuscript, so you can put the two next to each other and just easily compare where things are coming from. Then the next two sections actually refer to the results in the manuscript, so whether the numerical results match, but also whether the inferential conclusions match. This is a bit controversial maybe, so some people would say that checking whether inferential conclusions match goes beyond computational reproducibility, but not according to me. So in this case, ideally, the inferential conclusions in the paper are the most important thing in the paper, so you want them to be reproducible. And then the final two sections consider the figures in tables, so whether the reproduced figures in tables match the figures in tables in the original manuscript. So far we've had a total of 25 submissions. 14 have been certified as reproducible. This includes resubmissions after peer review, where peer reviewers have asked for some additional analyses, so I had to redo the reproducibility checks. 10 of those papers have already been published. I'm not going to showcase all of them, just a selection so that you can get an idea of the breadth of topics that I can cover. It's basically anything. And as I said, reviewers and editors are quite happy when they see that people have gone through this process, so we have some positive feedback, quite anecdotal, but here we've got one editor said that they were intrigued by the use of the formal checking. and my reproducibility report, and they were very happy with the process. And another reviewer mentioned that this was, a great methodological plus of the approach of the paper. Now, if you are interested in having your work checked as being computationally reproducible, if you're not affiliated with the School of Psychology, you can add me to your future grants. Please do. If you are in psychology and you are working on a grant, please add me to your grants as well. If you're not, but you're working on a paper, I'm going to assume that you are interested in making it reproducible. The option to not is not available. So in that case, if your analysis is code-based, please submit it for a check. If it's not, get in touch, because there are resources I can send to help the transition be as smooth as possible. And thank you very much. Lincoln is no longer here, so his photo is black and white.
He's still alive.
Yes. Thank you. Any questions? Oh God, we're going to go that way. So Sam.
Thank you. Really cool stuff. In your experience, what kinds of things tend to go wrong when the result is not really reproducible? Can you give because I kind of very perhaps naively think that if I've coded up all of my analyses, that shouldn't be a problem. But it was the same every time.
Yeah. So we've had also some issues. My favorite one was so if it is code based, in that case, some issues usually revolve around copy pasting results from the analysis software to the paper, rounding errors in your head, rounding numbers in your head. That's a common one. So if you can minimize the copy pasting or the hidden work that you do on the numbers, that helps a lot. There was a case where the researchers weren't aware exactly how the functions they were using worked, so the default options were different from what they thought they were. So they thought they were doing one thing, but they were doing something else, so they needed to change it, which then changed everything. There was a case where there was an error in the function itself, so it was just not doing what it was saying it was doing. And then there are another fun one is missing data dictionaries are a big one. That's the one thing I'm finding difficult to get people on board with, because it's very boring to do. But there was a case where when the person did eventually make the data dictionary, they realized they were using the wrong variables for their analysis. So then that also
Big mistakes. Yeah.
did I miss something about your question?
No, that's right.
Don't.
Yeah, to kind of follow up on that, I was wondering whether you had any kind of gut feeling about what are the barriers and obstacles for people whose mind is, not everybody sending you their works because they are not aware. Is it because they are, time kind of issues? Is it because they are afraid? Is it like what? I'm
very nice to everyone. Everyone who submits something has been bent by the nice, kind Reny. I think, time is a big barrier because it does take, if there's loads of issues, it can take a long time. And sometimes you can't really anticipate how many issues would appear, because as I'm doing the check, people then change their original analysis, so then I have to do it again. And that arrow, which goes from initial report to people make amends, that was supposed to be a one-way street, but it's now it's a roundabout. So I think it's mostly a timing issue. I don't see how people would not know about this when I talk about it all the time. And maybe people are a bit afraid that I'll find something and they don't want to know about it, but again, I'm very nice. Yes?
You mentioned how publishers were giving badges to such reproducibility, but I know they're not often paying for the activity, and I'm not surprised by that at all. But I was wondering, in a kind of utopian vision of commercial publishing, would that be something that you think publishers should be paying for, or do you think that you're, as an independent substitute, that independence is important if it's the right side?
If it's done in-house, so as we do it in this case, I don't think the publisher needs to pay, because it's the responsibility of the university and us as researchers to make sure the work is good. If it's an outsourced service that the publisher offers, I would like to be paid, yes. Jennifer?
I guess, in your preference, at what stage in the process of producing a manuscript would you ideally like to be involved? Or said another way, what's the earliest that people can kind of get in touch with you so that you can avoid some of the problems down the line by setting up good practices early on that you think you'll have to solve?
As early as even just coding your experiment could be useful. So to make sure that the data that comes out of the experiment software is organized in a way that would be easy to then analyze, I'm happy to help with that. But if you've already collected your data, as early as starting to analyze it would be useful, so that I can guide people through the common mistakes in coding that they can then avoid, like reusing variable names. That's a big one that leads to a lot of errors, and that's something that we can talk about. The good coding practices we can talk about before the analysis exists, before the code exists. So at any point, basically. Any other questions? Yeah.
A lot of students I work with want me to check all their code all the time. It's a big task, and I think what I favour is training them to put checks in along the way, every step of the way, so that they are making sure that they're interpreting the right thing, using the right rules, etc. I could see your job becoming quite unmanageable if every student got themselves an opportunity to do this, and I just wondered if that envision that becoming training.
Yeah, so the scheme is currently not open to students. It's only to staff members and research students, so undergraduates and master's students are on their own. But I can still give them some advice on if the report that I use is on OSF, it's openly available, so people can share this with their students to give them an idea of the types of things they should be aware of when they're coding or analyzing their data. But yeah, if we were to check every student's work, we would not survive.
I have to say, Reny and I developed our training course aimed at staff. Yeah. But Reny spent a lot of time adding in common errors, pitfalls that are barriers to communication. So all that staff training contains explicit guidance on how to avoid these kinds of problems. And we've got recordings that we've looked about on those topics, which is really good.
Yeah. All right, time for lunch. Thank you very much.
People in the sense
Okay, so I'll get started. I'm going to be talking about an alternative publication method and an alternative to for-profit publishing. So just to start off with, I'm sure everyone knows this already, but the basic purpose of academic publishing as it currently stands is to do things like disseminate knowledge. So much scientific work is coming out all of the time, and we can't
read all of it and evaluate all of it ourselves. So we need some sort of filter to help us figure out what to read and what's going to be relevant to us. Part of that is doing some form of quality control. So if you're an expert in your field, ideally you can do this yourself. You can go through preprints, for example, and evaluate for yourself whether the work is good. If you're trying to learn about a new field, then knowing that the journal that you're reading does some form of checks and that the work is to some degree solid is going to be really useful. And then a third one is you need some sort of evaluation of relevance or impact. And again, this is some way of figuring out whether what you're reading is worth reading, whether it makes some sort of important or interesting contribution. And some of you might have seen this figure before. So as your journal of choice has a higher and higher impact factor, this probability of replication goes way down, which is obviously a massive problem, because ideally those journals that are most selective and are apparently telling you about the most important or impactful research with their greatest scientific relevance, ideally that's actually scientific work that you can learn from. But if it's not replicating, then you can't learn from it. And so why does this happen? These glamour journals, like Nature, for example, they all want their glamorous results. So you've got this publication bias problem where they are biased towards accepting work based on its novelty, for example. So work which goes against what you might think or counters expectations. And sometimes the reason why it does that is because the results are simply not true. They often focus on storytelling, so telling a neat story rather than giving an honest reflection of the data. And that both of these together lead to impact factor chasing, where you get your p-hacking and your selective reporting and hypothesizing after the results are known. So all of this is probably known to you already. You might have seen this figure before. I really like this figure. So this is a list of, most of these are industries. And on the y-axis, we've got the profit margin. Here's, can you not see my, can't see my mouse. So just at the end there, we've got alcoholic beverages in blue. Then the second blue one from the right is tobacco, then pharmaceutical industry, then banks, and then the one in red is Elsevier. So why is Elsevier so profitable? Because they're not paying their kind of content producers, so that's the academics who produce the research. They're not paying the editors, they're not paying the reviewers. And then you have to pay to publish in these journals, and then you have to pay to read these journals, or your library pays to read these journals, all of which is funded by taxpayers. So this is obviously completely unacceptable. And the publication process goes something like this. So you design your study, you run your study, you analyze the data, you write your paper, and then you choose some journal to submit to. You might do this multiple times, and goes through peer review with your unpaid peer reviewers. And you might get a revise and resubmit, or you might get a desk rejection. And the reasons for rejection could be that your paper is out of remit, so they don't think that your results are interesting enough. Sometimes reviewers will say that they take issue with the design of your study. They don't think it's testing what it should test. Sometimes they take issue with your analysis, so they think that your analysis isn't sufficient, and then maybe you can revise the study, but maybe you don't actually have the data to answer your question at all. I think this one is probably, along with out of remit, is the most common for a straight-out rejection, is that the results are kind of uninteresting or null. So the reviewers just don't think it's worth publishing this study at all, and there's no real way around it. There's nothing you can do to make it more interesting to them. But if that doesn't happen, then you end up getting published. So this can take a really, really long time, as most people here will know. So this setup is really undesirable for so many reasons. And one alternative is peer community in. So peer community in is an umbrella of, so you've got peer community in neuroscience and I think chemistry, and the one I'm going to be talking about is peer community in registered reports. So this is community-led, so there's no profit, no businesses, and it does preprint review. So you write your preprint, you can submit it to PCI, and then it will be reviewed by people in your field, and then those reviews are published. So everything is transparent. You upload your data, you upload your code. And the people kind of in charge of this preprint review process, PCI call recommenders, but it's like an editor. And what happens is that when you write your recommendation as an editor, that recommendation is citable. So you don't get paid in cash, but you do get paid in some sort of job points, in the sense that you have a kind of, it's not a paper, but you have some sort of scientific output in the form of your recommendation. And that has a DOI. And so in peer community and registered reports, it's taking this model, and what you're reviewing is a registered report. And it looks something like this. So you start off designing your study and your analysis plan. You are going to write your paper blind to the results. So you're just going to write your abstract introduction methods. You don't have your results yet, obviously. And then this is what you're going to submit to PCI registered reports. This goes through a really, really thorough review process. And if it's deemed solid, so your experimental design, your analysis plan is approved by your peer reviewers and your recommender, then you get this in-principle acceptance, stage 1 acceptance. Why this is a general advantage of registered reports. It's not necessarily specific to PCI, but the reason why this is so valuable is because you're getting that feedback about how effective your analyses are going to be at the planning stage, so you can actually fix the problem in advance. And then PCI will recommend your, if you get this in-principle acceptance, then PCI will recommend your stage 2 report regardless of the results. So there's no impact bias there. There's no publication bias. And then again, the recommender will write this published citable recommendation with the DOI. So if you're the recommender, you get something for this enormous amount of time you're putting in. So once you've got your stage 1 acceptance, you run your study, you analyze your data in line with your peer-reviewed plan. You write the full paper, so that's basically just adding your results section in your discussion. Everything else stays the same. Then it goes back to the recommender and the peer reviewers, and now they're checking that you have stayed true to your stage 1 report. So they're checking that you haven't changed your intro methods and that you have done all of the analyses you said you were going to do. And then if that is accepted, you can send to journals. And a nice thing about PCI registered reports is that it's paired with certain journals who will accept a PCI recommendation. So you can skip their peer review process and just get published straight away. These are the PCI-friendly journals. So if you want to submit, what you would do is you would deposit your preprint to a repository, say OSF or something, and just submit it to PCI from there. And then, just like with a regular journal, your submission gets a recommender, an editor, finds reviewers, and then this peer review process begins. It's quite quick a lot of the time. It's like maybe 3 weeks, ideally. After the review process, your preprint is recommended. All the reviews are published, the decision letters, everything is open. And then again, the authors can submit to PCI-friendly journals without any further peer review. There are some journals which are kind of semi-PCI-friendly, which might want to do another round, but there are also some, including Cortex, and I think neuroimage reports, I think, which you can send to for no extra peer review. Or alternatively, you could publish in this kind of general Diamond Open Access journal, peer community journal, if you wanted to as well. There are various formats, so you could just submit a standard registered report. But you could also do something called a scheduled review if you're under some time pressure. So you submit a kind of miniature version of your stage 1 report, like an extended abstract, which is called a snapshot. And you submit that in advance of submitting the full stage 1 manuscript so that the recommender can line up their reviewers in advance, because sometimes it takes a bit of time to find reviewers. So this speeds things up, and you have a deadline by which you have to submit your stage 1 reports. So this can work quite well. For example, if you're, I don't know, on a grant that's going to run out soon and you really need to know that things are going to happen by a specific time. And just to kind of summarize how this all works, so you have various options as a scientist about where you're going to publish. You can go for traditional journals, not-for-profit society journals, preprints, registered report. You can write a registered report. You can do preprint review, for example, at PCI, or eLife do this now as well. And then we've got PCI registered reports at the bottom here. It's only PCI registered reports that have no profit motive, no peer review gatekeeping, because they don't, the people reviewing your work are not the ones who are going to publish your work. Fully open access for free, and deals with the replication crisis because they're publishing registered reports. So this is the kind of gold standard open method for publishing. Oops. And thank you. Does anyone have questions? Yeah.
This might be a naive question from someone who's not very experienced in the publication process. How would I tell, how would one tell which journal is sort of for profit, or like, and which one is like, you know, good with so how would one know these things?
So what I do when I don't know about specific journals is kind of look up who the publisher is, and then you kind of end up, you can either just go on the Wikipedia page for the publisher, or you end up learning, because there are so few of them. So Elsevier, all the Elsevier journals are for profit. Springer Nature is for profit. PLOS is not for profit. You can end up just learning it that way, but then also you can just look on Wikipedia. Yeah. Yeah, I think of them as kind of society. But yeah. Yeah.
Lots of university press feeds back into the university. So there's a relation to that. The relation to that is non-profit.
Yeah, APA journals.
Any publisher, other publishing, so it's basically, I just need to do a proper statement.
Yeah, yeah, and then I mean, there'll only be a set number of journals in your field that are kind of fall in your remit, and I suppose over time you only need to learn about those, and then maintain a list.
In other words, money goes into an academic society and treated as a
Yeah.
That's APA,
Science is a
science.
Science is society.
And there's a lot of evidence analysis here, runs from academic society, which some of mine is going back to academia. So, around that person.
Maybe just say, well, like, I guess the general thing I we did at the library is to look at the aims of school more so than directly kind of profit or non-profit, because there's maybe a lot of exceptions there. They're saying just like why they publish a lot of like society journals, but why they are for like profits, because there's a lot of kind of there can be a bit of a case by case thing. I think what they're saying really makes sense. Is if you don't know kind of publications like intro is the matter of get feedback, ask around like their colleagues and stuff like that, and people that use them where they're publishing and why.
Hi, actually, I'm very excited to question, first of all, about the registered reports, whether the recommender and the reviewers, the stage 1 and stage 2 is the same. I guess there can be quite a large interval between doing stage 1 and stage 2 and doing stage 2, it really is before the experiment happens.
Yeah.
And the other question was, so some people
Yeah,
might be
they're supposed.
being able to review the stage 2. The other question was, with funders into this, integrating this process, so we thought actually I'd quite like the funders study made on this registered stage 1.
So for the first question, ideally they're the same. I think I did one with you, Zoltan, recently where it changed, but I've never seen that before. Yeah. And then with the funding, do you mean somebody who would fund PCI, or do you mean somebody who would fund the actual research? Oh. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that mechanism exists now, but...
No, it's Templeton said they're going to fund consciousness registered reports. So specifically funding registered reports. And then some other funders have done that just as a one-off. But getting the stage 1 approved is part of the process. So, it's actually done. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
So what's the point of publishing in open access like golden journals if it would be accessible as a people?
I'm really sorry, I couldn't hear. Will you repeat it?
Publishing open access like golden journals if the people would be accessible. So do you think there's no need to publish open access?
That's a good question. So, for me personally, yeah. So for me personally, the point would be that in many cases, you would be publishing in a journal that's for profit, and so they're profiting from taxpayer funding everyone else's labour. I guess that's not the case in a society journal, and I think lots of people would be very happy to not publish kind of gold open access in a society journal, and on the basis that they've got the preprint up. And I think that's fine.
Yeah, a journal asks me, do you pay $2,000?
Say no.
Because it's other, as you said, other people. So as long as you people don't, you don't need to pay extra money to the journal.
So we need to move on to the next one.
Do you want DuckDuckGo as your default browser, Zoltan?
No.
Okay. Okay, now this is back. Just gonna... Okay, scrolling might be a little bit awkward, but we'll just deal with it. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. So I'm going to talk about how we can use automation in research. Now, the original motivation for this talk was the fact that I worked and collaborated with colleagues on a really interesting project, and I had a lot of fun doing it. I was involved in the kind of technical capacity and statistical help, and it generally was just a really fun process. So I suggested, hey, I could talk about that. And then Zoltan suggested, yes, but can you make it useful for a lot of people? So I'm going to try to accomplish that in this talk. So when it comes to research, there are a lot of tasks that can be tedious that we would ideally like to automate. Now, when I say automation, especially when we say these days, kind of the default baseline is often people's minds go to things like ChatGPT, large language models, in which we kind of ask the chatbot to give us some sort of an output that is otherwise routine, like, I don't know, produce a cover letter for our publication in a journal. Things like that. So I will say that I'm very much aligned with what Jennifer was saying earlier in their talk about critical AI literacy. And what I want to talk about is how we can use coding, but in the way that allows us to retain the focus on transparency and retain control and understanding about what it is that our code does. So basically, I'm talking about ways to automate things and automate the things that might be tedious and boring, but in the way where we can still have full accountability for what it is that we are producing. So this project that I worked on, so this was done with Charlotte's lab, and I was working on the 4-day work week project with Rhiannon and Nick. And the objective of the project was very broad and very ambitious. So it was very ambitious. So it worked with the UK Biobank data. And if you're not familiar with the Biobank data, it is a massive database that contains a lot of health variables, a lot of biological samples. I think at this point it's about 500,000 people that are included in that. So it was a really, really large data set. So there was a lot of options for exploration in this data set. And what the project set out to do as an objective was to identify how the time that we spent at work relates to various health outcomes. So in total, we had 248 outcomes, and they were kind of various subjective and objective health indicators, so things like diet, immune function, sleep, lifestyle, physical and mental health. The main predictor of interest was work hours, so how many work hours do individuals usually work in a week. And then we had a lot of kind of covariates that we also added into the models to adjust for them. So we had like covariate groups that included demographics, covariates from kind of like a work life, household and socioeconomics, and different health factors. And the way that these... I can do this. There we go. So the way we fitted these models was kind of in a sequential way. So the first we fitted the most simple model. Then in the second step, we used our predictor as work hours and then added one group of covariates. Then we added another group and another group and another group. And essentially we had to rinse and repeat this process for 247 outcomes. Well, 248 for all of them. Now, in total, when we kind of went through this process, what we generated was 3,720 models. In addition to this, there were also some follow-up tests. So let's, for example, if we found significant interaction, we wanted to follow up on that to kind of break it down. There were things like post hoc tests. We fitted some robust models, which Andy will talk about later. But for each of these models, we needed to complete quite a large number of tasks. So some of these included calculate the fit statistics and pick the best fitting model, multiple testing corrections, because again, we're fitting 3,000 models, calculate effect sizes, and I just want to give a shout out to easystats, where's Dom? There is no, who will talk about easystats later. And easystats it's a suite of packages that just makes especially scripted analyses a lot easier. So it is a lot more streamlined, so we were able to use them in quite a few points of the analysis. So instead of 17 lines of code, you have one that actually does what it says on the tin. We needed to check the assumptions for every single model and then export the results and plots so that we could actually inspect them. So quite the undertaking. Now, When it comes to checking assumptions, right, so the models that we fitted, basically, they make some assumptions about some aspect of the data and the population, and if these assumptions are not met, then you can't really rely on some aspect of your results. Now, often, kind of in practice, what researchers often use is significance tests, and the nice thing about significance tests is that they will tell you whether or not your assumptions are violated. So, for example, you get a p-value, and if that p-value is significant, then that's bad, and you should feel sad about your data and your assumptions are violated. If that p-value is not significant, then you can go and celebrate. Now, the problem with significance tests when it comes to assumptions is that they are generally rubbish. Now, especially in this context, if you're using p-values to determine anything, if your sample size is large enough, eventually you are going to find a statistically significant p-value. Now, with some of the analyses that we had, I think they had about 100,000 participants in them. So they were generally just not very informative. Now, ideally, what you should do if you're going to check your assumptions is to use the residual diagnostics, and often in the form of plots. Now, you don't really want to do that with 3,700 models, so that was a bit of a challenge. So what we decided to do... this is, by the way, this is another example from easystats. So these are the kind of plots that you would check. So you could think like things like posterior predictive checks, how to check linearity, homoscedasticity, influential observation. So you can all kind of, you can understand that from a plot, but again, you can't expect nearly 4,000 of these. So what we decided to do was to kind of automate these processes, and the first step was to extract the residuals from the model, and then calculate some statistics that will allow us to maybe define some cutoff points and then use some flags to kind of determine whether or not a human actually needs to look at the plot or whether everything is okay. So we calculated Cook's and leverage values, calculated the skewness and kurtosis of the residuals, calculated the level of heteroskedasticity, then we stored everything in a data set or a spreadsheet, and then determined some rules under which we would flag the rows that potentially have problems so that an actual human can look at them, and obviously export the diagnostic plots for the problematic rows. Now, this is not meant to be a coding tutorial, but I just wanted to kind of demonstrate how transparent this process can be. So in a few steps, you can essentially get from a fitted model to an export of values that tell you whether or not your model has any sort of problems. So in this first bit, we are just defining, this is just kind of like a small use case, but we are defining a function that takes the model that we fitted as an input. In this line here, we extract the residuals, and in this final line, we create a little data frame. We can use the model formula as an ID so that we always know what kind of predictors we had, what kind of outcomes we had, and then we calculate skewness. Now, if you were to apply this to a model, you would then get the kind of evaluation straight away. If your models are stored in a list, you can use something like this to apply that function automatically to all of those models. So you don't have to do it one by one, but you can do it in literally 4 lines of code. And then finally, once you have that, you can calculate, you can kind of decide on some sort of a rule. So for example, here we're creating a new column called check skewness. And as an example, let's say if skewness is greater than 1, we decide that, yes, someone should look into this because it's probably too much. And if it's, in all other cases, just no, and we're not going to bother with that model at all. And the reason I'm showing this is just to kind of show how transparent this is, because you don't kind of, obviously, like, if you don't code, then this might seem like a lot of nonsense. But if you do code, you can look at this code and kind of understand it line by line. So you retain the understanding of what your code is doing. And then you can go from this starting point and add more conditions, add more things that you can check while fully understanding your code and not really giving that up for the sake of speed and convenience. So once you have, you can kind of produce a data set like this. And again, this is a resource that you could share. 10 minutes? Is that what it means? Okay. Is a resource that you could share on, for example, open science frameworks, so that researchers could then, they could look through your code, but they can also look through the exports that you've produced to see if you are applying sensible conditions. Now, when it comes to some other, so this was quite a niche example of how automation can be applied, and it was quite like an overwhelming use of automation, but ultimately it was a really, really interesting project that explored the data set in depth. Now, some other kind of more practical examples. So as part of my PhD, which I did with Andy, we ran quite a large simulation that at the time of designing it, I didn't realize quite how large it was. So we evaluated basically evaluated different kind of linear models, OLS models, and robust models under various conditions that you can find in practice. So we simulated different levels of skewness and kurtosis, different heteroskedasticity levels, and then all sorts of various model designs. And then we did the tally at the end, and we ended up with 97,488 conditions. Now, in the traditional publishing format, this is not really an amount of plots that you would be allowed to put into your paper. So what we did in the end, we picked some that we thought were kind of the most critical for the paper itself, but then through automation, we were able to wrap these in I can allow that's fine. We were able to wrap these in basically a website, which we'll see if it opens. Yeah, it opens. In a website that allows researchers to browse through these materials and explore every single combination for themselves if that is what they wish. So, for example, we could take a one-way design with 3 groups that are being compared, and we can just kind of scroll through everything. So if there is, for example, if there is a researcher who has quite niche conditions, they could go in and kind of look them up, and they would be able to see how their model could potentially perform in those conditions. Now, another similar example, and again, just to say, this is a lot of plots, but in total, I created about 10, maybe 15 plots, and then through the automation, you can kind of repeat this process and create all of this resource through a few lines of code. Now, another example which is really kind of useful in, especially in open science, is the automated generation of code books. So a code book, it's very good practice to have one, especially if you're sharing a data set. It's meant to be something that researchers can access as a sort of a guide that talks about how to use the data set, what are the variables, for example, what are the variables named, what is the description, what is the level of measurement, is it a factor, is it a continuous variable, what's the minimum, maximum, things like that. Now, manually, this can, again, take quite a lot of work, and it can be quite annoying if you then decide to, let's say, change some variable names, or you add some columns and you then have to manually edit the code book. But what we can do with a bit of code is to take the data set and extract a lot of the information out of that. So in our first year statistics modules, we use, so this is from a SMARA study which collected a study of statistics and mathematics anxieties and related variables in university students. So this was done by our colleague Jenny Terry, and it's a massive data set that just contains lots of variables. So we use it in our classes so students can complete the worksheets. And for them, we've compiled a code book that explains what is in the dataset because it has hundreds of variables. So, for example, you could scroll through this and you can see that if you see a column degree major, it is the column that talks about a degree major. For example, SPLD talks about diagnosis of a specific learning difference. The response options are no and yes. All of this, or vast majority of this, can be automated. Now, I will say, like, especially paying attention and being intentional about the kind of supporting documents that you release along with your data is really important because it can prevent this sort of performative open science, which does happen and is unfortunately quite common. So a couple of years ago, we did a project where part of the project was reanalyzing a lot of data sets that are openly available. And most of the time it was using information that is in the paper. Sometimes there was code available, but what wasn't so uncommon is that you would just get a data set that is pure chaos. And the one that stands out was a data set that had about 100 columns. All of them were called V1 to V100, no description at all. It was shared on PLOS, so PLOS has open science. I'm done? Okay. So So I'm done. So basically, do open science well and think about the resources. And I'm just going to leave this here. And the bottom line is, if you want to do any of this, if you want to get involved and if you want to think about how you can implement this in your research process, come talk to us because we love working on this. So thank you. Yes.
How many programmatic models did you have to draw up for the development?
I think it's a question not for me. Do you have a sense of like the proportion of models that actually had to be inspected?
Still going through them. Adds to it quite a lot. Yeah, if anyone wants to talk about biobank, or anyone has any really good tips for working with data sets large like this, please do get in contact with Rihanna. Please let me know. Still working through. I think it's worth saying this kind of further automation we do.
That we're working on, trying to work on now to help with the next step to not do this stuff.
This is fun.
It's a good one. I mean, this is all really great. The code book, in terms of the automation, I imagine it requires quite a bit of manual input for some of the descriptions that you produce there.
Yes, for the descriptions you would need some sort of a manual input, but it can be combined with like additional sort of like a data set that has a description as long as the IDs are matching. So some manual work will be required depending on what sort of information you want to include. But then once you have that, you can automate over that and produce the rest of it in all of the entries.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Cool. Thank you.
Right, hello. Small caveat, I had to drop one of my children off at school for a school trip at 3:15 this morning. So I feel like I'm going to make about as much sense as ChatGPT. But I'm going to do my best, but my brain is absolutely fried. So Zoltan asked me to talk about robust statistics because for some bizarre reason he seems to think that's something I know about. But we'll give it a go. Most of what I'm going to talk about is actually from Martina's PhD, so quick thanks to her. For those of you that are interested in what it's like doing a PhD with me, it's kind of like this. Every week Martina will come to me and say, we've got all these problems, we need to do this, and how do we solve this? And I'd go and throw out all these ideas, and then she'd go away and then come back next week and go, oh yeah, I did all those things you said. We've got 95,000 conditions. Does that matter? I'd go like that, and then, yeah. Anyway, rinse and repeat, and after 3 years, she produced a, frankly, brilliant PhD. So I'm going to talk about the assumptions of ordinary least squares models, which are really prevalent in psychology. So if you've ever done a regression, ANOVA, anything that has sums of squares in the output, you've used OLS estimation. And we know there are various conditions which affect how trustworthy our results are from OLS estimations. First is inferential cases, and then there's a bunch of assumptions that apply to these models, and these are in order of importance. So linearity, I told you my brain's fried. Linearity and additivity, so that's basically the form of the model that you're fitting is generally a linear model. That's what people are doing. So the process you're trying to model has to be a linear and additive process. So that is the most important thing. If that's condition is not met, you're just simply fitting the wrong model. The population model should have spherical errors. What this means is they should be homoscedastic, so that's your homogeneity of variance assumption, and they should be independent. And there's assumptions around normality of something or other. The population model should have normally distributed errors centered around 0, so on average the error in the prediction is 0. But also there's a sort of really convoluted relationship between the sampling distribution of your parameter estimates and the t-statistic and its t-distribution that revolves around that sampling distribution being normal. It's frankly a world of pain understanding that link, but it's there. I went down that wormhole once, and it's probably my strongest trauma memory, to be frank. What are the consequences of not meeting these conditions? This is a little schematic. There's sort of two things that can be affected. One is the parameter estimates themselves that you get. You obviously want these to be unbiased estimates of the thing that you're trying to model. And for those estimates to be unbiased, you need linearity and additivity. See earlier. You need your errors to, on average, be 0, and you need no outliers or influential cases. All the stuff about normal distribution doesn't apply to that at all. You can still get unbiased estimates with non-normal errors, for example. If you happen to want your statistic or your parameter estimates to be efficient, which most people don't care about because that's a statistical property, you also need spherical errors. Now, probably what's of more interest to most people is the other side of this diagram, which is having unbiased standard errors, because these tap into confidence intervals, because they are based on the standard errors, and also significance tests. So if you want unbiased standard errors, and therefore unbiased confidence intervals, and therefore unbiased test statistics, you need linearity and additivity, average errors distributed around 0, no outliers and influential cases, spherical errors, and you need your sampling distribution of your betas to also be normal. Again, though, normality of residuals doesn't affect any of this at all. Now, interestingly, there's really fairly straightforward ways to circumvent any of these problems. So if, for example, you have influential cases, you're worried about getting robust estimates of your parameters, you can do that using something called M-estimation, which downweights influential cases. You can get robust standard errors pretty, again, straightforwardly by asking R or your preferred software to produce your standard errors using a family of techniques that give you heteroscedasticity consistent standard errors. Don't say that when you're drunk. And you can also derive standard errors empirically using bootstrapping and things like that. Anyway, basically, you can sort of solve these problems relatively easily. So even in second year on our stats modules, our students see this diagram. It's like the list of the rank order of problems and their solutions. Non-linearity, well, you fit a non-linear model. That's pretty straightforward to deal with that problem. If you have influential cases, you can get robust estimation. You just change the function using R. If heteroscedasticity is your problem, you can ask for, oh my God, let's say it again, heteroscedasticity consistent standard errors, again using a function R. If normality is your problem, if you've got a big enough sample, you don't need to care about it anyway. So this is all like really, really solvable, but still important to check. So what do researchers know about this stuff? So one of the studies that Martina did, she very generously used the word we a lot in her thing. I'm going to say what she did, rather than we. Is she recruited 800-ish psychology researchers, and we basically asked them a bunch of stuff. So we had a section to this study which is their knowledge of these OLS conditions. So we had 50 statements, 10 per assumption or condition, and 5 of them were true, 5 of them were false. We just asked them to, on a scale, say how true or false they thought the statements were. We did not put this through Vlad's process of scale development, I'm embarrassed to say. Anyway, second part of the study was we asked them about their analytic practice. So that was sort of what do you know, and then we asked them what do you do. So we gave them 2 scenarios. One was experimental, one was kind of cross-sectional. We gave them the list of assumptions, and they basically ticked boxes, and we scored them from 0. I don't check this assumption, and I don't do anything about it. 1, I check the assumption, but then I don't do anything about it. Seems quite bizarre thing to do. And then the top of the pile was I check it and correct for it if there's a problem, or I don't check it, but I automatically correct for it anyway, which is a perfectly valid approach to this problem. So in terms of these diagrams, if the chalkboard thing will work, we've got our true statements, and we would hope to see distributions like this here. If people actually know that these are true statements, the bulk of the distribution should be at this end, and for our false statements, oh my goodness me, We want to see something approximating that. So we want the bulk of the distribution to be at that end. So that means on the left-hand side, everyone knows the statement is completely true and they're fairly confident about that. And on the right-hand side, everyone knows the statement is false and they're very confident about that. So we'd be hoping to see that sort of pattern in every panel of this diagram. But as you can see, we don't see that. So, for example, we find a nice green. We have situations here where we've basically just got a pretty uniform distribution, right? No, people don't really know about that. Some people do, some people don't. And if you sort of tally that up across those sort of 10 statements, you could probably, and this is true of actually all the assumptions more or less, on average, people are coming out with scores of about sort of 5 or 6 on this 10-point scale. So they know a bit, but not too much. They're kind of getting 2 1s or 2 2s on our quizzes of assumptions. So just here are the plots for outliers. Again, we're looking for, the bulks of the distribution sort of meeting in the middle of the diagram, but you can see they're in the right place for some items and not for others. And just for the sake of time, I'll whiz through these. Heteroscedasticity, this was probably one of the better ones in terms of how things are distributed. Independent, there's stuff people don't know. Now, in terms of what they say they do, we've got these in each panel, so each one of these represents an assumption, and with each panel we've got that scoring of 1, 2, 3, where 1 is they're not attentive to it at all, 3 is they're completely attentive. So ideally, what we want to see is some nice dots up in these corners of the plots. That would mean everyone was being highly attentive to every assumption. And as you can see, everywhere I'm circling is a gaping hole, a void of attentiveness. There we go. Across the board. Not as attentive as we'd like them to be on every single assumption. So what they say they do is not pay very much attention to this stuff. And we had a look at whether this correlates with their knowledge. So on these diagrams, basically the curve going down is I'm not doing anything at all. The entire sample is not doing anything at all, and that's going down. So that's saying, more and more people are doing something, more and more people are doing something down here. And we've got knowledge on the x-axis. So basically, as knowledge goes up, the proportion of people not doing anything is going down. And with the green line, we've got the opposite pattern. So at 0 knowledge, no one's being fully attentive, but they get more or a bigger proportion gets attentive as knowledge goes up. And we're sort of interested, I guess, in these crossing points. So where does it become more likely that someone becomes attentive than not attentive? And, I mean, hopefully, what you can see here is these crossing points fall very high for some of these on our scale of knowledge. So it's only when people's knowledge is getting sort of between sort of 7 and 10 on our scale, they're actually sort of switching between not doing anything to doing something. There are some assumptions where it's a bit lower, so like heteroscedasticity does seem to be one where people do pay a bit more attention to it. And in terms of normal sampling distribution, this one here, I mean, knowledge, no impact whatsoever. It's just, we don't do anything. No matter how much knowledge we have, we just ignore this one. So that's fun. So we thought, well, okay, that's what they say they actually do, but what do they actually do? So in a second study, we looked at nearly 200 psychologists, and we gave them some actual data. Again, 2 data sets, one experimental, one cross-sectional. We said, go, here's a hypothesis, go analyse it, and then Martina coded the scripts to basically have a look at how attentive they were to the various conditions that we've talked about. And the take home here, we've got various categories of attentiveness. And these 2 blue categories are the categories of sort of people doing something that would be a reasonable standard that you might expect from a scientist. And as you can see, for normality, although admittedly that's the least important of them all, our blue regions are tiny, homoscedasticity or heteroscedasticity, tiny, basic checks and outliers, a bit bigger. I mean, people can commit to some basic checks, right? But still tiny. And influential cases, tiny. So in terms of what they actually do when they're given some data is they don't attend to these things. So I guess the conclusion from this is We don't want to be those people in the Centre for Open Science and whatever it's called. I've got no idea what it's called. Barely know what day of the week it is, to be honest. But we can do better than this, right? And I guess the sales pitch is if you're using OLS and you want to do better than that, then talk to us and we will attempt to help you. Ta-da! Yeah.
Thank you. Really, really cool stuff. Really good job. I guess kind of getting your standard errors right is probably one of the most important things that you deal with when making invoices. Do you think that there's an argument? People are busy and they can't do everything all the time. Do you think there's an argument to be had to say we just always use, if you're using bootstrapping, if you're using OS, we always bootstrap errors, and that's just what we should all do, and that's a default position, so that we.
So I have, paper, but I can't remember what it was, made that exact case. Just always use heterozygotic those standard errors because they will correct the amount of heterozygoticity you have. So there's kind of no, I don't think there's really a rational argument to not use them, or to at least do the sensitivity analysis of what happens when I use them.
You're encouraging us to check, but if someone's very lazy and they don't check, would a viable approach just be to apply robust procedures blanket as standard?
Like the simple answer is yes. As a general principle, I think you may as well just apply the robust model, but it's not quite as simple as that because you are, say for example, it's like, what are you correcting for? So you can say, well, I'll just always correct for heterozygoticity, but what if you've got influential cases, then you're not correcting for that problem. So if you don't look at where you might have problems, you might correct for one thing, but you're not correcting for everything, perhaps not correcting for the most important thing. Like, is linearity a reasonable assumption? Like, everyone should just be asking themselves that question fundamentally. There's not a simple I just did this thing and it will work. Like you need to pay attention to the process you're actually trying to model in the first place. So there's a simple basically that's a reasonable principle. It's just always go robust. But it's not that simple because what you do does depend a bit on what your problem is. And like I said, there's kind of a rank order of problems. So if someone says to me, I've got influential cases and heterozygoticity, what should I do? I say, well, correct the influential cases, that's the bigger problem.
In relation to that last about big problems, when I was taught, going back rather a long way, we were all, it's mainly in the context of Hanover, but we were all sort of,
Please don't say the phrase Hanover is robust. Well, you were lied to, Alan.
revise some of those ideas. But what do you have a feeling on the one hand that how important are those violations? And do people looking at what people know, do they know about which ones are very important to correct?
No, I think there's definitely a sort of educational vacuum, which I've tried to fill, but apparently some people haven't read my book. Possible to believe. But no, this is all, it's actually a really good question because there are, you can have an unbiased estimator that doesn't actually make any difference to your conclusions. So there's sort of a practical sense of, well, some of the time, no, it's not going to, I can't stand here and say some of the time it's going to radically alter your conclusions. There'll be occasions where it does, but a lot of time when we're talking about sort of what might be considered trivial differences. But are we about to publish? can't remember, I've lost track. The one where you reanalyse like 7 billion published things. Okay. Can you remember the bullet point message from that? Sorry, let's put you on the spot. It's fine to say no.
I think because we did the reanalysis with one of my master's students actually, and I think it was with the p-values, it may have been like a proportion of 10% that makes a difference. So in a lot of situations, it might not practically make you change your conclusion, but then the problem is that you kind of amplify that on the level in which the world researchers are publishing, and you get a record that is not as accurate as it could be. I think that's.
And I mean, the other, you mentioned Rand Wilcox, he's published quite a lot on how, under violations of the assumptions, power of tests is just unpredictable. It's not like you can say, oh, in this situation, you have too little or too much power. It's just, you can't predict whether you've got too much or too little. So, that's problematic because, you don't know what error you've made.
Would a simple good rule be if you're doing a t-test, do 20% means the rights and the Welsh, and let's do that.
Yeah, I mean, Wilcox is big on 20% trimmed. There's various tests that work on 20% trimmed data, and he's published quite a lot showing that, that's a sort of a sweet spot of where you get robustness in your test statistics and p-values. So he would certainly endorse that, yeah.
And is there a sort of particular robust regression analysis?
Well, again, it depends what problem you're trying to fix. So, with if you're trying to fix the problem of influential cases, the LM-ROB function in R essentially does an M estimator, so it sort of downweights extreme or influential cases, and that's another technique that Wilcox talks about a lot as being kind of a good approach. Anyway, all right, good.
All right, so I'm going to talk to you about, easystats, which, as was mentioned, is a collection of R packages. And rather than just kind of showcasing to you different features that it had, I thought it might be more interesting to kind of talk to you about the origin story of that project, because it coincides with also how I fell into the world of open science and open source developments. And initially, I'm actually not at all, neither a method researcher, even I wasn't interested in statistics at all. I was trained as a clinical neuropsychologist, and my PhD was about the paradox of fiction, which is a philosophical question that asks why do we feel emotions to things that we know is unreal. And in that context, we try to answer this with typical kind of cognitive experimental methods, using a paradigm with different conditions. We were recording multimodal physiological data. And at that stage, while I was kind of starting on this journey, I could feel that the available methods that, to me, to analyze that data with a typical ANOVA framework was probably not optimal. I had a mix of intra and inter-individual data with multimodal nature. The predictors were mostly continuous, which didn't lend itself well to kind of groups and contrasts. And so I really started to think, like, I want to juice out and make the most out of this very hardly acquired data. So how can I do it? And so I started to look on the internet, what was hot at the time, and the two main things that were discussed in the methods kind of Stack Overflow groups and so on were mixed models and Bayesian statistics. Keep in mind this was about 15 years ago. And I could feel that these were probably methods that could be beneficial to me, to my data, to address some of my issues. But this led to actually a new set of issues, which was that they were difficult to implement in practice. To give you one example, the package at the time to do mixed models wasn't computing or wasn't giving any p-values, which in practice was a bit inconvenient to use. And so this came with a new set of solutions, which was to become better at R and to implement the kind of code that I needed to be able to implement these methods more easily. And one of the decisions that was made was, rather than writing that post-processing code directly in my scripts, I would put that into functions that I could then reuse in all my projects. And this actually led to open up the door for a new outcomes, which was, why not package that up? Turn this into an R package, which other people can easily install and reuse, and release it open source. And this is essentially led to my first R package that was called Psycho. And at the time, this package had two main features. So it has Bayesian analysis features as well as mixed models post-processing features. And at some point, I was starting to run a memory experiment, and I needed to compute things, signal detection theory. This is like the prime, criterion, and so on. So I started writing functions for this, which I then put into that package. And a couple of years later, this paper kind of came out about the reproducibility crisis, which you might have heard about. And this was accompanied, within that kind of era, there was also the beginning of tools that were allowing to merge things like code, results, writing together, like our Markdown or Jupyter. And I thought maybe this is kind of the future of scientific publishing. It's really just kind of, rather than writing papers and then copying from our outputs into these papers, which, as Reny mentioned, is a kind of opens the door for a lot of errors, why not have some ways of transforming the statistics into kind of a automated report? And I started working on tools to create this, automated reporting, which I will talk a bit about today. And again, I put that into Psycho. And so, this led with kind of was accompanied with personal benefits. I basically learned how to do, statistics. I learned a lot about statistics during that time. And also working on this open source package really led to a kind of tangible impact. See people engage, open issues, and when you're doing a PhD, which can be quite a lonely journey, it was quite rewarding to engage in this open source world. So this got published at some point, but I knew then that not all was perfect. In particular, this package started to had feature creep, meaning it had a lot of disconnected kind of tools, different features, different functionalities, which made its purpose kind of hard to read. Due to its kind of organic evolution, it was also very not organized. I was learning basically software development as I was writing this package, and so it wasn't really well thought of at all. And critically, there was a bit of duplication. So at the time when I was writing that on GitHub, there was another person, Daniel, that was writing his own kind of set of packages, and we had really a lot of overlapping. We were seeking the same kind of things, and so one day I would see that he wrote a new function, and I would just say, oh, that's very interesting. I would copy that, adapt that to my own package, put that into package, and we had this kind of overlapping parallel kind of progress. So I knew that things had to change, but at the time that wasn't the priority, so I defended my PhD, took a flight, went to Singapore, and then took a big decision, which was to kill Psycho, pretty much a couple of months after it got published, or rather to only keep in Psycho the psychology-related features and reorganize the rest. In particular, the idea that I had in mind was to separate the Bayesian features into its own kind of package and the reporting feature into its own other package. And then I thought that there needs to be a kind of third heavy lifting package that does a lot of the low-level kind of pre-processing. And critically, I thought, well, I might as well try to join forces. And so I dropped an email to the Daniel person saying, hey, we kind of work on similar things. What about we start this new set of packages together? And so this is essentially how easystats got born. And the first package that was really kind of created from our beginning collaboration was the Insight package, which essentially powers the whole easystats collection. So since then, the collection of packages has grew quite a lot. We now have 10 packages, 7 core maintainers, with quite a lot of citations and downloads. And to give you a bit of fun facts, we pretty much chat daily on GitHub, but we never met in person. We never had one meeting, not even online. All of this was done on our free time, and we never got any money from any grant to do this, which I think speaks a bit about how efficient sometimes research can be. So what is easystats good for? So as essentially what it does is it tries to bridge this last mile that you have once you kind of write the code, you have some output from some models and stuff, and then what goes in your paper. And there is this really kind of painful bit there that you need to really understand, interpret, format, report, and this is the gap that easystats try to fill. So just to give you one small highlight about the report package, so initially the idea of this report package is that it would have one function called report in which you can put pretty much anything, and it would just make a nice report, like a textual report. So this is when you report a data frame, it gives you all the kind of summary statistics. One of the functions that is underused that I really love is report participants, because this function, when you apply that to a data frame, it will look for variables that are named like age, gender, or whatnot, and it will write that bit, like this number of participants with the statistics. And this is super convenient to make automated reports. So I have, that bit that goes into your paper, it is automatized, and every time I add new data, I just rerun, and this kind of gets nicely updated. So this report function works for quite a lot of different tests. So this is like, if you put a t-test, it will output the report of that. Same for correlations and even for Bayesian models. And the way, I think this has good educational value because it shows how people can format and phrase things. Often the problem is not really the interpretation. The challenge is often, okay, how do I actually write that up in my, in my paper? And so this can give you a kind of an example of how to phrase things in a, I think, relatively optimal way. What is critical, what information can be included, and how to organize them. And yeah, in general, this easystats framework really allowed us to do much more than we could have done. This is just an example from one study on visual illusions, and we fitted quite complex models, general Bayesian additive models with, and this post-processing that would have been impossible without all the work that we've put into easystats. And more recently, we have developed a new kind of model with Andy for modeling choice confidence data. And again, a lot of the post-processing was allowed through easystats. So just a couple of words about what might be the future for it. I'm just going to give one small idea. Shame that Jennifer is not here. And what I do believe is that on top of, obviously, the publishing landscape needs reform, and this was, absolutely well presented by Maxine. But on top of the publishing framework, I think the scientific paper itself is something that needs to be changed. Back in the days before the internet, having journals made sense because you would buy a journal and you would read all the papers that are in there. But today, in the era of internet, this is kind of, people access specific articles directly. And it's quite trivial to associate these articles with a small document that contains additional statistics or additional kind of analysis or whatever, supplementary materials. But I do believe that what we should kind of quickly try to evolve into is in a more kind of open science era would be that the core of the main production of the scientific process should be a kind of whole repository that contains all the data, the analysis scripts, the papers, everything should be there in basically like a GitHub repository. And this should be the main output. And the paper in that context could be just like a small kind of advertisement to show, where things are, how to find them, and how it is organized. But the question is, and I think we are somewhere in between these two phases. But the question is, what comes next? And I think that AI-assisted kind of research is, will at some point appear, and in that context, these repositories might be even more relevant and even more important. And these repositories could contain two types of products. They could contain a small paper that would be for humans, essentially, to read, and it could contain also a report that was designed and optimized for AI agents to be read, that contains information in a kind of very efficient and optimized way. And so with this idea in mind, we've started toying with a new feature for the report package to make it ready for the future. So currently, the reports that reports make is a human-readable output. It is deterministic, it is stylistically optimal, it is good for kind of education and creating reproducible documents. And we now added, it's very work in progress, an argument which is called audience, and you can change that to audience equal AI. And this will then create what we believe is an AI-optimized output, so it's meant to be kind of token efficient so that the AI can get as much information as possible in the clearest possible way. And the idea is that we could basically have the documents for humans as well as the documents automatically generated for AIs that would allow them to really kind of get all the nuance required and all the, and assist better, essentially, without errors and hallucinations. So that's really work in progress. It's literally a couple of weeks ago, so yeah, that's about it. I'm going to skip on this that I wanted to say and just say thank you.
So the mixed models are they now the Bayesian hierarchical models?
Are they now, or
yeah? I mean, the way packaged up mixed.
Well, we don't implement these models. We typically, there is a lot of packages that can be used for making Bayesian mixed models, like BRMS, for instance, and we have functionalities to nicely post-process them, to do tables of parameters, to compute all the posterior indices, base factors eventually, making plots and this type of stuff. So we leave them, people, the models themselves are done using other packages. We just implement a universal way of post-processing them using the same functions.
No, I'm curious about the AI-friendly thing that you're producing here. So how would you have control over what AI is being trained on? Because essentially you're kind of saying you're producing it for robots, right? For the AI. AI is created the internet, GitHub, whatever, for all the information it can get, supposedly, right? So how are you intending to only feed it that?
Yeah, it's a good question. That is slightly beyond what I can control or predict. But my idea is that there is more and more deep search AI, that will actually try. And I do believe that a lot of the limitations are technical limitations. I can imagine that in 1 year or 2 years there will be AI that are very data-driven, that will actually look for published papers, that will be able to assert the quality of the papers to some extent. And so I don't think it's a inherent impossibility or an ontological impossibility of AI to be able to do this. And so I think there could be essentially AI systems that then kind of scrap GitHub repositories or any kind of research project and would look for these kind of AI optimized reports and get most of it from there and eventually. But again, I'm not even sure that's needed because technically nothing stops AI agents to be able to reproduce and rerun the code and get, write new kind of analysis and extracts everything if the data is there initially. So again, it's just an idea we are toying with, that correspond to what is the future of the research output, really. But I don't have a very strong opinion that that's the kind of way to go or anything like that.
Sorry, just to wrap up what I'm thinking. I guess I can see how that would be useful for proprietary AI where you could only train it on that kind of AI-specific data and kind of have control of what you're feeding it, essentially.
But even if the agents are already trained, on a lot of data, you can then still say, okay, base yourself on these papers or these projects or this data, and they will still kind of use, primarily what you are telling them to use. And this gets better, by the day. You can just upload PDFs or anything, and it will just kind of really try to stick to what you included. I'm quite AI positive, sorry.
Reduces bias and hallucinations.
No, we quickly implemented that just to have to say something about the future. But yeah, it would be interesting to see whether indeed there is even a need for AI optimized reports, whether this idea even holds. There is indeed potential work, research work to be done there, and the benefits. Well, so typically my papers tend to be slimmer and slimmer, especially on the results side, and more I'm just linking to this, GitHub webpage of, a Quarto document, and so I believe that could be because you can set essentially in the option say, okay, all the reports needs to be for AI, and then you could create a clone version of that supplementary materials that is AI optimized, and then an AI agent could look specifically for it, and then read it and get a better sense of the data. It could help you to assist you to write the paper eventually. Imagine you write the analysis, you finish, you say, okay, these are my results, and that's probably a better basis than giving it just like copies of tables or whatnot. So the idea is to make AI-assisted research perhaps more easy. And again, I'm not saying it's a good thing or not. I'm just toying with ideas at this stage.
With a 20-minute coffee break. Hi.
My slides, they'll all be on the internet. So
yeah, okay. Let me just pause the recording.